Hao Ren was unlucky because it was raining heavily outside, and if he hadn't lost at rock, paper, scissors, obviously he wouldn't have to go out to buy something for the whole dorm. Suddenly, Hao noticed a flying human silhouette in the sky. Zhen looked surprised at the girl who was falling the ground. In turn, he tried to catch her. A few moments later, she landed directly on Hao, thus knocking him down. And having fallen to the ground, they lay in the pouring rain on the ground. Hao and the unknown girl literally merged in a kiss that both of them didn't expect. At this exciting moment, she opened her eyes and found that Zhen was also looking at her. He continued to stare at her in bewilderment. Hao abruptly jumped up and hurriedly apologized to her for this awkward moment. With a slight twist of his face, he noted that he had swallowed something incomprehensible, after which immediately inquired how she's feeling. Hao caught himself thinking that this girl was quite beautiful. Our hero glared at her. At this time, she let herself up on her feet. Zhen continued to watch her. Then, the girl confidently and rather quickly headed in his direction. She began to demand that Hao immediately give. Our hero, in turn, said that he did not take anything from her, but on the contrary, saved. The irrepressible damsel said she never wanted him to save her, much less kiss her. She insulted him in every way possible. Zhen replied that the kiss was accidental, due to which you should not accuse him of such a thing. She wanted to know if he was telling the truth, saying he would investigate. At which point people around them started paying attention, thinking he had forcibly kissed her. Some passerby noticed it was some excuse to flirt with a pretty girl. The girl was saying it was here, pointing to his stomach. People started saying she was already touching it, due to which the surrounding people thought that they were a young couple who were just having fun this way. Hao asked her to stop. The girl kept repeating for him to give it back to her immediately. At this time, Zhen felt some kind of change in himself. He was literally twisted by an unknown pain in his stomach that the girl noticed, who said he needed to return it immediately because he might die. Hao nervously waved her away and asked her to leave him alone at last. Our heroine didn't know what to do to get the unknown object out of him. She looked thoughtfully at Hao and noticed that his fingers had turned green. That naturally noticed and our hero, not understanding what is happening to him, and why his skin began to change color. The crowded people also wondered, not realizing what had suddenly happened to him. Zhen demanded her to stop making a scene as he had a severe stomachache as a result of her rescue. At that moment, an unknown beautiful car pulled up. People didn't understand where it came from. One of the crowd remarked that such a car was worth working even harder for, admiring it in every way. Unknown people, led by a gray-haired man, got out of the car, who came up to the girl, bowed to her, and said that the master had sent for her, calling her Miss Z. Correcting his glasses, he similarly asked Hao to follow them as well. The latter was surprised in return. At this time, an unknown girl, savvy to their timing because Ren had stolen her item, urged them to deal with him. The guards approached Hao, who realized that nothing good was likely to happen to him. A short time later, in the high-rise building where Zhen and Zai were brought, all the bodyguards bowed to her, welcoming her home. Z in turn told them to drop these formalities. Hao asked Z if her father was Zhao Guang, who was the director of Mingji Group. She smirked and said that she was his daughter. Our hero had heard that Guan was on good terms with both the underworld and the government. He thought he was finished. They continued to follow the gray-haired gentleman into the spacious elevator. Upon entering, Hao noticed that literally every square meter was guarded. Meanwhile, the gentleman pressed the elevator button, and they all went to the 108th floor together. Stepping out of the elevator, Zhen began to look around. Everywhere was still just as full of guards. Among them, there were many influential people of the seizure world. As Hao looked at each of them, he realized that things were much more serious than they seemed. They were expensively dressed, wearing rings and bracelets, some glancing haughtily in his direction. Ren hurriedly caught up with Z and the gray-haired gentleman from whom he had fallen a little behind because of his curiosity. Walking through the vast corridors, they headed towards Zhao Guang's office, where our hero finally met Father Tzu, who in turn immediately approached Hao, and with an angry face, asked if he was the same Hao Ren. The main character was literally sweating with excitement, and rather modestly said that he was Hao Ren. Guan looked at him, and after a few seconds, he asked why he had eaten his daughter's inner core. Zhen surprisingly replied that he didn't know how important it was that he had accidentally swallowed it. Father Z looked at Hao and smirked. Our hero didn't know how to affect the situation. Guan leaned over to him and smiled at him, saying that he was obliged to marry his daughter. Standing to the side, Z was literally taken aback by such an ultimatum from her father, whereupon she immediately made her indignation known, saying that Guan was just bullying her. Rushing to her side, her father hurriedly calmed her down, telling her not to get so heated. Then he thoughtfully stepped aside, thus becoming his back to Hao, and wondered if the skin around his wrists had turned green, and if his whole body ached. Zhen interrogated him about how Z's father could know this, and what to do about it. Guan replied that this happened because he had swallowed the core of the dragon Z, adding that the dragon core serves as the source of the dragon tribe's power, which always helps them fly and rule this world, thus granting them power. Hao in turn couldn't believe what was happening. He thought it was some kind of newest type of hologram. Father Tsu went on to say that if a person were to suddenly receive this core, he will inevitably die eventually, and there is no way to counteract that. Hao was literally shocked at the information he heard, and didn't utter a word. Meanwhile, Chao Guang asked what he thought of his daughter Zi. Jen muttered inarticulately to himself that she was a rather rude and spoiled child, which extremely angered Tsu, who in turn literally boiled over after a second. Asking what Hao was mumbling, she confidently and spitefully headed in his direction. Guan put out his hand to keep her out, urging her to watch her manners, saying that as a dragon, she couldn't cultivate. And even more so after losing the dragon core, Zi will not return to her true form, adding that she will die within 5 years. Father literally shed a tear. Hao realized that he did not want to become the cause of death, even for such a spoiled girl. Jen asked if there was any way to get that core out of him and return it to her. Guan sadly replied that his human aura had affected her, and if they moved the core back to Zi, it could get worse. Hao interrogated him. Is there really no other option but to wait for Zi to die? She couldn't understand why he was worried about a man he'd recently met, assuming he wasn't a bad person after all. Zhao Guang replied that only their marriage would save her. Ren said that he was only 19 years old and she was a middle school student. Zi's father replied that they were in no hurry to go anywhere, in view of which he could be engaged first, adding that Hao should constantly cultivate their art to strengthen it, and at this point, Jen won't be able to give her half of Zi. Realizing what they were talking about, they literally looked at each other dumbfounded. Zhao Guang asked Hao what he thought of all this. Our hero was not happy about the situation. Zi also reciprocated. Father Tsu said that he had kept him long enough, and would therefore ask him to take him back. Guan's assistant asked Jen to follow him. He thanked him graciously. The unknown guy was watching from the side, realizing that Hao was Miss Zi's future husband, from which he was extremely angry. He immediately headed after Jen, trying to block his path. Suddenly, Zi stood up for Hao, telling him to stop acting like that and get out of the way. The guy literally sizzled our hero with a look. Jen meanwhile recognized the old man, who persuaded Lei Rui to not be so rude to their guest. At this moment, Hao asked the old man if he was the vice principal, Mr. Lu Qing. He replied that he was. Adding that they would return to the university a little later, they walked down the stairs. After a while, they gave him a ride to the said place, and Lu Qing began to explain to him, showing a certain notebook, saying that this was their art of spirit concentration, and if Jen followed the instructions, he would learn. Lei swept up that the man wouldn't understand their art. Qing urged him not to talk to Mr. Hao like that. Jen had no way of understanding why Vice Principal Lu seemed so respectful. Lastly, Qing told Hao to cultivate diligently, and he in turn would check on him periodically. Our hero began to familiarize himself with the contents of the notebook, and only managed to read that it was a scroll of spirit concentration. As at this moment, someone placed a hand on his shoulder, thus frightening Jen. They were his acquaintances who said that they had not seen him for a day, and he had already hit on a girl, and became the son-in-law of the deputy director. Hao tried to deny it, but one of them said that the news had already spread throughout the university. In the meantime, Zi Yujia walked past them, and all the guys were paying attention to her, even the ones with girls. Naturally, our hero and his friends also noticed the beautiful Sei. At this moment, one of his acquaintances remarked that Hao had always been a good guy, but now he was cheating on Yujia behind her back. Ren immediately told him to cover his mouth because someone might hear them. His friends swept up that he was too nervous, saying that because of them he was now in an awkward position in front of Zia Yujia. Suddenly they met gazes. Hao was literally gazing at the beautiful Zi, blushing slightly from embarrassment. She in turn was just as slightly embarrassed and quickened her step, moving away from them. Jen and the guys looked after her, one of them confidently stating that she clearly liked Hao. A few seconds later he received a new message on his phone from Zi Yujia, in which she wondered what had happened to him, as she had heard that some people had taken him away. Satisfied with himself, Jen realized that she was worried about him, and hurriedly answered her that it was just a little misunderstanding, and not to worry so much. CE replied that he'd been out of sorts lately, and offered him a walk after the lectures. Hao realized he had a chance to explain to her what had happened that day. After a certain time, our hero went to the university, where the bell for class had already rung. Ren calmly waited for the instructor, unlike the rest of the students who had caught sight of Miss Suhan. They started to actively make up and shouted that she was Goddess Su, who in turn just managed to walk into the auditorium with a huge bag in her hands. Miss Han, clearly in a bad mood, headed to her desk, where she adjusted her glasses and gave everyone an angry look. Some students kept shouting for Su to turn her attention to them. She looked at them for a while longer, then said confidently that she wrote down the names of the people who sent her love letters, and whoever does it again will get a bad grade on the exam. Then promptly announced the start of their lesson, writing the topic on the board. Hao's acquaintance said they deserved it because they had no right to break into Miss Han's office. Another said that a bad mark on the final exam is nothing, and the main thing is not to get a rejection. Su called for silence. Hao tells a friend that she is too cold, making it no wonder she still doesn't have a boyfriend. However, Miss Sue heard him and replied that his lack of concentration affected his homework. The exposed Jen immediately fell silent, realizing that he might make the situation worse. Hao took out his phone to text a message to the beautiful Z, who was a few meters away from him. Our hero suggested that she have lunch together after all her classes were over. He watched her reaction. Yujia in turn read his letter with admiration, and after a certain time they left the classroom satisfied and went to have lunch together. But just at that moment, Miss Han was called out by Hao, who asked him to come into her office. His friends began to tease him, asking him when he had time to seduce Goddess Sue. And only poor Z, realizing that the date would have to be postponed, she held his gaze sadly. Jen had walked to the teacher's office in the meantime, and she immediately inquired as to which side he was on. Hao didn't understand what she was talking about and asked her which side she was talking about. Sue suddenly grabbed his hand and demanded that he answer her question. From surprise, Jen was confused and asked what she was doing. Miss Han in turn leaned her palm against his stomach. Finally realizing she wasn't wrong, she hurriedly twisted his arm, then urged him not to pretend and tell the truth where he got the aura of the Eastern Ocean Dragon Tribe from. Hao replied that he accidentally swallowed the dragon core and did nothing. At last, Miss Sue released our hero's hand and stepped aside, saying that he would be sure to clarify this point at the Eastern Ocean Dragon Tribe, adding that he was free and could go. Ren began to speculate how Teacher Han could possibly know about all this. Suddenly, he felt Sue put her arms around his head and squeeze a little. She told him not to tell anyone about the Dragon Tribe, otherwise she'd have to eliminate him. Hao wondered who she was, and why she could afford to eliminate people. Han realized that he really didn't know anything, saying that in fact, she was the inspector, which finally confused our hero because he had just figured out the dragon's core. Meanwhile, the sun had long since set over the horizon, and it was late evening. A tormented Hao returned to his home, where only silence awaited him. He began to study the contents of the notebook Deputy Director Ching had given him again. However, no matter how much Jen cultivated the art all day long, he never managed to understand anything. A few seconds later, his phone beeped with a message. Hao immediately decided to read it because he thought it might have been Z, but it was actually written to him by the Dragon King. Zhao Guang asked him to come over for dinner on the weekend, which our hero clearly wasn't thrilled about. A few days later, Hao naturally came to dinner at the Dragon King's house, where they all sat together at the table. Mrs. Hong Yu graciously offered him refills. Jen thanked her politely and smiled back, trying his best to match them. Sitting to his left was Z, who was literally chowing down on food, saying it was her favorite dish. Mrs. Hong Yu took the plate of meat away from Guan, saying that he shouldn't eat fatty dishes and should take care of himself. Hao asked Hong Yu if she had heard anything about the inspector. Zhao Guang asked when he had already met the inspector. Ren replied that it was their teacher from school, and her name was Su Han. Mrs. Hong Yu said that they control some kind of dragon issues, and he should stay away from them. A concerned Hao wondered how powerful they were. Guan replied that there were 8 cultivation realms for the dragon tribe, and some inspectors had reached that level, adding that Su Han is so strong that she could defeat 2 Lu Qing at the same time. Hao had no idea that such a young and beautiful girl was stronger than the vice principal. Guan said that Su and the dragon tribe may have long-standing ties. Besides, the inspectors can execute anyone they deem guilty, but assured Hao that he wouldn't let her hurt him. Ren found it suspicious that Zhao cared for him like his family. Father Z said that once Hao became the legitimate representative of the dragon tribe, the inspectors wouldn't bother him anymore. Hong Yu in turn asked how his cultivation was, and if he could hide his aura. Jen replied that every time he cultivated, it was as if he could feel something getting stuck and nothing would come out. Realizing that he's failing, yet he's still trying. Hong Yu looked at him sadly, after which, in an attempt to calm him down, she said that he should not be too hard on himself, and it was necessary to leave things as they were. Mrs. Hong Yu asked Hao to tutor Z for lessons since she was having a little trouble with English, but she flatly refused, saying that someone like him couldn't help her. Jen tried to restrain himself, but he still uttered that she was a little brat. This made Z even more angry, and she immediately got up from the table, stating that he does not need the help of our hero, who also could not stand such behavior. He said nervously that he didn't want to help her with anything himself, especially not with that attitude. Z's parents didn't understand what had gotten into her and wanted to stop her, but she instantly ran to her room. Zhao Guang and Hong Yu apologized to Hao, realizing that she had caused trouble. Mrs. Hong Yu said that Z can have a temper, but she actually has good intentions. Ren agreed with her. They in turn escorted him to the exit. Hao said goodbye and thanked them for dinner. He was walking down the street and he couldn't calm down, thinking about the situation, thinking she has very bad intentions because she's acting like a little devil. Suddenly checking his pockets, Hao found that his cards and wallet that were in his right pocket were missing. Our hero began to nervously examine his pockets once more, and realized that they were still missing. Ren rushed back to King Zhao's house, thinking he had left them there. Running up to the corner of their house, he found them still standing at the door, and Mrs. Hong Yu was asking Guan about Hao. Our hero realized they were talking about him. Father Tsu said it was better to listen to their daughter. Hongyu stated that it was necessary to tell Ren about the time limit on his cultivation because Z might not survive. Hao realized that he had too little time to study cultivation. Guang said that Ren is a kind man and would feel guilty if he knew that Z was willing to risk his life for him. Mrs. Hongyu replied that they could save their daughter and take away the dragon core by force, but in that case, Hao would die. Jen literally scrolled through the acquaintance and all the moments with Z, who he thought was so mean. Our hero hardly realized that Zhao Yanzi had taken on such a responsibility. Hao noticed that dragon scales were beginning to appear on his hand. He was well aware that it was because of the dragon core that was inside him. Plus, Jen had to help her with her English classes tomorrow. Z at this moment stood pensively in proud solitude on the balcony, and she looked at the moon disk hanging in the night sky, where cold stars glowed in the distance. Meanwhile at Zhao's house, Guan sadly summarized that without the core, Z wouldn't live to be 20 years old. Rui suggested cutting Hao. To extract the core, the old man agreed, saying that Miss Z's life was far more important than some person's life. Lei said he'd dump his body in the ocean and no one would suspect or find him. At that moment, an angry Z burst in, saying that she wouldn't let him do that. Chu replied that there was no other way to ensure her survival. Yanzi stated that Ren was not guilty of anything and there was no need to touch him. Besides, she can't exist normally knowing that Hao's life was taken to save her. Which, to her surprise, made her father Guan laugh, who hurried over to her. And in an attempt to calm Tsu down, he said he had an idea. She cried into her pillow and said she didn't want to kill him, but she wouldn't marry him either. After a while, Hao knocked on her room, saying he had come to help her with her lessons. Tsu opened the door a little and wondered what he was doing here. Ren replied to teach her English, and if she didn't open the door, he would tell Mrs. Hongyu. She replied that she wouldn't open up to him. Hao hurriedly went to Hongyu to tell him everything. Tzu in turn opened the doors, though, and said he could do that to her. However, as she tried to leave the room, she caught her foot on the threshold. Thus flying right into our hero, Jen was able to keep her on her feet, saying he wasn't a snitch and never had been, adding that he wouldn't have told Mrs. Hongyu anyway. Z went into her room and was about to close the door behind her, but Hao followed her and noticed that she had a large room. Z hurriedly closed the door in response, thus pushing him out of the room. But the doorknob, along with the entire lock mechanism, broke off and fell to the floor. In the aftermath, Z flew off to the side of the bed, which she hit her head on. Hao in turn smirked and asked what was wrong with going into his fiancée's room. Z painfully rose to her feet, Jen still standing in the doorway. After that, she went to her desk, where there was a computer and a textbook next to it, which she picked up and suddenly threw it at Jen, saying that he should familiarize himself with it. Hao didn't have time to dodge, and the book hit him in the face, which he clearly didn't like. But our hero held himself in check and did not show it, but a lump came out on his forehead. Yanzi was frightened for a moment herself, after which she asked Hao in surprise. Why didn't he dodge? He saw her throw the textbook at him, adding that the punch made him look dumb, and it wasn't her fault in any way. Hao walked up to Z and smilingly said that it was his fault for not dodging, and gently placed his hand on her head. She was surprised, and at the same time annoyed by this behavior of Jen. Z literally demanded of him to remove his hand immediately and not to touch her. Jen graciously agreed, then said they needed to learn English, which made Z even more annoyed, but managed to keep silent this time. Hao and Z sat down at the table. He was carefully familiarizing himself with the assignment in the textbook, then showed her exactly where she was supposed to change the time and make the edits, which for Tsu was truly a total nightmare, and she still didn't understand well. Regardless, several hours passed, after which Z couldn't stand it. She stated that she didn't understand because it was too complicated for her. Yanzi literally collapsed on the table, saying she'd had enough already. Hao noticed that she was an incorrigible child after all. He decided to make concessions, saying that they would take a break now and play, but then they would continue. Tsu thought he was doing it on purpose, to tell her mom later. Hao in turn said he would play with her together since they were now on the same team. An overjoyed Z agreed to his terms and hurriedly sat down at the computer. She immediately turned on her game and enthusiastically began to play. Yanzi was clearly enthusiastic, from tired to an active child in a moment. She was diligently tapping away at the keyboard buttons and was literally all in the game. Hao watched her video game endeavors intently, however, after a while. In the middle of the screen, a sign popped up for her, signifying the end of the game. Jen called her stupid, which only made the spoiled child angrier. Z indignantly interrogated him to repeat what he said. Hao ignored her and crouched behind her and told her to watch how to play. She got embarrassed. Zai looked at him. Jen was explaining to her how to play, and that it was necessary to organize the defense behind and make some space in front. Then she specifically stated that his tactics wouldn't work to piss him off. Hao stood up from the table, thus giving her the opportunity to finish the game herself. After a few seconds, a joyful Zai loudly shouted that she had won. Jen walked over and saw an inscription in the middle of the screen signifying victory. He swept up that his technique had worked after all, Yanzi claiming that she had done it all on her own. Hao gave her a characteristic look, after which she still agreed, saying that sometimes he could be useful. At this moment, Mrs. Hongyu knocked on their room with a plate of various goodies. She said she had brought them some fruit and they could take a break as they were probably tired. But Mrs. Hongyu saw the two of them together. They were very close to each other. Hao and Z in turn realized how they looked in her eyes and looked at her in surprise. Mrs. Hongyu hurriedly left, urging them to enjoy their time together. They looked at each other in silence for a while. Then, the silence became too awkward for both of them. Hao thought it would be better to sit down, which he later did, taking his English textbook with him. Z was sitting on a chair at her computer and glanced in Jen's direction, who looked out from under the book, realizing that the situation was indeed awkward. After a while, Z asked Hao how his training was going, and whether he works hard at it. She glanced at him, he said sadly, that he still hasn't reached level 1, and he constantly feels like something is missing. Zai thought it was her turn to be his teacher. She said that he should have come for help from a genius like her. An overjoyed Jen inquired if she could teach him everything. Yanzi got up from her chair in a businesslike manner and looked at him haughtily. Then she smiled and said she'd be sure to help him. Z hurriedly explained to him that the concentration list had 3 steps. The first is to interact with heaven and earth, and you need to feel the energy of nature and purify the body at the same time. The second step is to channel energy into the body to strengthen it. The third stage is to release the energy around the body, and only after that, Hao will be able to develop more advanced techniques. He was well aware that these 3 stages were connected and none of them could be missed. Tsu added that all elements reinforce each other. Fire reinforces earth, earth reinforces metal, metal reinforces water. Water strengthens trees, and trees strengthen fire, and water's extreme softness. Concentration of spirit is the cultivation of water. So the key is a balance of softness and hardness. And to contain the hardness, you have to use softness. Z urged him to try it. Hao sat down in the middle of the room in lotus pose and closed his eyes. He imagined a drop of water formed between his palms, and tried to use the softness to hold back the hardness, which you have to admit, he did pretty well. A drop of water snapping off into the depths of the water. In the form of a small molecule, it seemed to freeze in the water after a while. It was as if the drop had plunged into Jen's consciousness, thus awakening a peacefulness in him. Suddenly he opened his eyes, which had blue drops in them, and found that he was in water, at an unknown depth. It was as if Hao was going down and there was nothing he could do about it. Moreover, he felt that it was meant to be. Jen couldn't realize what space he was in, but he still felt peaceful, as if merging with the energy flow and waves of nothing but calmness rolled in. The unknown did not frighten him, but rather the opposite. Hao himself was drawn to it, the energy literally emanating from him. At a certain point, he felt his body sweat, and a state of peacefulness began to release him. Jen suddenly opened his eyes and began to look around. He realized that he was in Tsu's room, and the condition finally went away. She said that Hao had made a breakthrough in cultivation, and it was all supposedly due to her excellent teaching. Jen played along, saying that of course it was to her credit. After all, she was a princess after all. A satisfied Z said that this was the end of their first lesson, and hurried him out of her room. Hao graciously agreed, and said he would help her with her English the next day. After that, walked out of her room and headed towards the exit, where he said goodbye to Guan and Hongyu. Being in a good mood, Hao leisurely left the Dragon King's domain. From the balcony, Z shouted to him to keep evolving in the way she had taught him, for with her core, he would succeed. Hao, smiling back, turned around and gave her a thumbs up, hinting that he understood. The next day, Ren went to the university, where he sat down at his desk and began to read the art of cultivation. Everyone around him was murmuring and looking at him. Hao didn't think he would be the object of attention. He didn't understand what was going on, why everyone was acting so strange and looking at him. Meanwhile, Ziyujia texted him, suggesting that we go for a walk after class. He made a counter-proposal to go out for dinner. Z naturally agreed. Hao thought he would definitely tell her everything this time. A certain female voice told him that he was extremely popular recently. Turning around, he saw Yujia. Jen replied that it was just gossip that had no reason to be trusted. Z smiled innocently in response and began fixing her hair. Then, nervously touching her earrings, it was noticeable how shy she was. Hao in turn remarked that he hadn't noticed how interested she had become in gossip before. Yujia said that she wasn't interested in the various rumors at all, and she just wanted to ask about the walk they had agreed on. Z realized that it sounded like she was asking Hao out on a date. Last time, Miss Su had interrupted his plan, causing Ren to not have time to tell everything to Yujia. So he really wanted to do it fast, so he decided today was the day. Ren immediately lifted himself up from behind the desk and stood opposite Z. Hao asked her if perhaps they could go out to dinner tonight after all. Naturally, Yujia agreed. They met after school as agreed, at an establishment in town. Hao and C sat at a table and dined, glancing at each other regularly. Yujia was as beautiful as ever. She kept thinking how to start the conversation. And after a few seconds, Z asked Jen who was coming for him in the limo. He in turn hurriedly replied, saying he had taken a part-time job as a tutor, and it was a client's limo. Yujia's hand that she was holding the chopsticks with trembled, as if something was troubling her. She then asked if the cute girl was his student who came to the college to find Hao. Jen replied that she was the one, assuring her that he was merely teaching her English. Yujia sadly remarked that she was quite cute. Obviously, Z was jealous of him for her. Hao was extremely surprised that the conversation suddenly turned to Z, and Yujia thought she was cute. Quickly changing the subject, Z asked him why Miss Su had summoned him to her office. Our hero replied that she was scolding him for misbehavior in the lecture. Yi urged Yujia not to listen to the chatter of Zhao Jiayang and the others. Meanwhile, it was late evening and a light breeze had picked up. Over their time together, they didn't think about how much time had passed. Yujia asked Hao if it was a joke when his friend said how he felt. Zhen thought it was finally fait accompli and he would tell her everything. They began to reminisce. That day his friends decided to help Hao express his love for Z, and if she agreed, the entire dorm dinner would be his, saying that he shouldn't miss such a chance because all the guys are running after Yujia in droves. His friend wrapped his arms around him from behind so Ren couldn't get out. He claimed there was nothing between him and Z. The other looked out from behind the column and said that Yujia was here, urging them to be quiet so she wouldn't see them. She was calmly walking down the hallway. Suddenly, Hao's friend ran out from behind a column. He greeted her kindly. Zhen was still just as against their scheme and was trying to get out. Meanwhile, a friend said that Hao has liked her for a long time, causing him to want to be her boyfriend. After which, immediately handed her an envelope that was supposedly from Zhen. Z blushing in response. And naturally, she took it, smiling in anticipation. Yujia leaned the envelope against herself and began to ponder what he could have written to her. But at that moment, Hao jumped out and rushed over to her to explain. From the surprise, Z was confused and couldn't utter a word. She accidentally dropped the envelope from her hands, which fell to the ground. A shy Hao stood in front of her, his friends hurriedly leaving the two of them alone. They looked at each other long and excitedly, not knowing how to start a conversation. Remembering this embarrassing incident, Ren and Yujia continued to eat their dinner. After a short pause, Hao said that his friends were joking around then, never admitting their feelings to her. Z sadly said that it was okay because they always liked to joke around. She asked if there was anything else he wanted to say to her. Yujia herself was mortified. Hao didn't know what to answer. Z decided to ask him herself. Questioning his feelings for her, she twirled her hair nervously waiting for an answer. Ren was clearly nervous, and not knowing what to do, he began to look away. At this moment, Yujia laughed, saying that she had annoyed him, suggesting that because of Hao's innocence, he was being bothered by strange people. Our hero scratched his head and asked what strange people were bothering him and who she was talking about. Meanwhile, they were being followed by Lei Rui, who was literally hovering in the air, and looked down on their not-so-friendly relationship. Chewie couldn't believe his eyes and continued to watch what was happening. They were having a nice conversation. Lei, on the other hand, was getting furious, making it even more so. He couldn't understand how this brat dared to see another girl when he was already engaged to Miss Z. At this time, Hao said goodbye to Yujia and urged her to be extremely careful. Z smiled back and waved to him as she said goodbye to him. Satisfied with himself, Hao looked after her with a pleasant feeling. Ren remarked that Yujia was much nicer and cuter than that little devil. Behind Hao, Jue leisurely flew up, saying that he had no idea about such a beauty, adding that he was merely judging by his appearance. Jen was surprised by Lei's appearance, who had an attitude that was clearly negative towards Hao Ren. Rui wondered if this girl knew that Hao was engaged. Ren hurriedly explained everything to him. Saying that it wasn't at all what he might have thought, Lei replied that he would teach him a lesson for such an act. The exasperated Chewie in turn slowly sank to the ground. Hao noticed that when he landed, the asphalt beneath his feet was literally breaking. In the next second, Lei threw a lightning-fast strike, barely catching Ren, who had no time to understand anything, and just stood there in a stupor. Rui said that he had no right to call Miss Z by her name, after which a surprised Hao slowly turned around towards Lei, noting that it was quite fast. He asked Jue if it was the Dragon Tribe's magic art. Lei, in turn, without responding, began to throw his strongest punches, from which Jen struggled to fight off. Rui surmised he didn't need any arts to deal with him. Then, with a smirk and a haughty glance at him, he once again threw himself towards Hao. Jen didn't know how to counter Lei's strength, but he wasn't going to back down either. Meanwhile, the confident Chu was unstoppable and was quite close to our hero, who in turn tried to block Lei's powerful punches. Hao was very painful to fight because he was well aware that Rui was stronger than him. He inevitably began to miss punches from Lei, who was literally dealing with him with a smile. Chewie pounced on the weak Jen again and again. It was like entertainment for him. Hao, however, realized he couldn't handle him and contain his power. Lei felled him to the pavement with another blow, and continued to beat him up. Besides being too strong, Jue was also very fast. Hao didn't have time to dodge. Jen was lying on the ground, smiling. Lei said that he was just a weakling. That only requires combat skills to handle. Rui slowly lifted Hao, who had been beaten by him, off the ground and began to smile into his eyes. saying that humans are like insects to dragons, and they can squash them at any moment. Jen realized that if this continued, Lei would kill him, so he began to use the power that Z had taught him. He realized that this was his only chance, and it was obviously worth a try since there was no other way out. Hao gathered his strength, applying his abilities to confront him. After that, his hands shimmered with dragon magic, and he clenched his fist about to strike, which Lei Rui naturally noticed but didn't take it seriously, saying that his blows would only leave scratches and urging him not to fight back. However, he clearly underestimated Hao's efforts, who in turn rushed to hit him. At this moment, the surprised Lei realized that he was still able to apply the skills. The hand he was holding Hao with loosened in an instant, and he slipped out. Seconds later, Ren threw a punch, only catching him slightly as Rui managed to dodge instantly, thereby finally letting Hao out of his control. And taking a step back, Jen realized that Z's training had not been in vain. Because he had practically succeeded, Chewie was puzzled. He clung to his cheek and wondered how he'd managed to break free. Hao replied that he had cultivated as Z had taught him, assuming that Lei was afraid since he might surpass him one day. But Jue urged him not to get cocky because he only had a first level, and hurriedly flew away, saying that Hao would never be able to master the art of spirit concentration. Jen immediately went home, and the next day went to the Dragon King's house, where Mrs. Hong Yu began to ask him what had happened to him. He replied that he had fallen and hit himself. Z said that she knew how difficult it would be for him to cultivate, but she didn't assume how difficult. Mrs. Hong Yu urged her to calm down. Hao remarked that it was Z's fault. Then, Hong Yu suggested to our hero on the weekend to go with them to the famous Greenstone Mountain. He graciously agreed, but wondered why suddenly Yanzi didn't mind, who said she wasn't the one who invited him, and not to look at her like that. A few days later, the weekend came, and they all went to Greenstone Mountain together. Hao sincerely admired the beauties on the Greenstone Mountain. Z indignantly replied that he was a redneck. Jen said she should have stayed home since she didn't like being here. It was as if she was annoying him on purpose, urging him to shut up. Meanwhile, they were entering a high-rise building, where Hao was followed by Lei Rui, who could not calm down and accept the existence of Ren. He looked out from around the corner, musing that soon his smile would be gone forever. They walked inside the building, which had an unusually beautiful interior, which Jen admired tirelessly, scrutinizing all the charms. Golden-colored huge columns entranced by their mighty size, a high ceiling in the middle of which was a luxuriously large chandelier, and undoubtedly the most beautiful fountain standing in the middle of the huge hall, under the chandelier. Hao was so engrossed in the sights of the hotel that he lost sight of the entire Zhao family. He thought it would be best to wait in his room until one of them showed up. As he rode the elevator up to his floor, Jen speculated about who he was going to room with. Realizing that it would most likely be Yanzi, he consulted the map of his room. But in his head, he was already beginning to imagine Sue waiting for him in his room. Where he was going now, he was momentarily embarrassed, as he didn't really want to spend the night with her. Hao was afraid to go into the room and see her, knowing that then the vacation would turn into something terrible. He walked slowly to the door to his room, comparing the card number to the room number. Jen realized he had come to the right place, and he took a few seconds to gather his thoughts. Afterward, he opened the door with the card and saw what he thought was a woman's silhouette in front of him. Hao slowly and fearfully crossed the threshold of the room as he suddenly discovered that it was actually Zhao Guang, who hurried him to take a shower and get ready quickly. Jen exhaled in relief and hurried into the bathroom. After a while, Hao was climbing up the mountain together with Yanzi. She was extremely indignant that she had gone with Jen, which she asked him about, and he said that her parents had insisted on it. Z told him to stay away from her, and Hao in turn promised Mrs. Hong Yu that he would take care of her. At this moment, a small snake dangled from a tree branch, which frightened Zai. She squealed like a crazy person and backed up sharply, thus hooking herself over a rock. Z flew backwards right into the arms of Hao, who held her back, urging her to be more careful and vigilant, adding that this snake is not poisonous at all, and there are plenty of them around here, so it has nothing to fear. Z abruptly broke out of his embrace and stepped farther away from him, then confidently stated that she wasn't afraid at all. It's just that snakes are disgusting. Hao replied that he was just as afraid of snakes as she was, and that was normal. Afterwards, he asked if they could continue climbing the mountain together. Zai resentfully mumbled in response. Jen took her hand and dragged her behind him, realizing that she's just a kid who sometimes behaves erratically. After a certain amount of time, they did climb to the top of the mountain. Panting, Sue was relieved that they had finally made it, from where the scenery was unusually beautiful, which Hao and Yanzi enjoyed admiring. On the mountain itself, there were also buildings and various structures which they hurried to familiarize themselves with. Z said that this was the Temple of Heavenly Unity where Taoist Master Zhang cultivated. The stone table and the amazing 1,000-year-old trees she offered Hao to look at. Zai dragged his hand. Jen was surprised because she suddenly became so active and changed her mood. Hao assumed it was some kind of trap that Z was planning. Walking over to the monolithic stone, Hao began to read what it said. By abiding in the primordial Tao, one can master the presence. Yanzi noticed that it was Master Zhang who had written it. If the desire is to hide the true self, it will manifest even more. If one weakens oneself, it will strengthen even more. Z swept that it was a way to control water. Hao recalled the stage with water in the cultivation art. She asked him to try the art of spirit concentration now. Jen agreed. Hao closed his eyes and began to cultivate. Behind him walked a man who was staring at his phone, not looking where he was going. As a result, he collided with the unsuspecting Hao. He dropped his phone from his hands, which fell to the ground and subsequently shattered. Then he demanded that Jen pay him for the broken cell phone, saying he wasn't looking where he was going. Jen stood across from the bulky man and inquired what exactly he wanted from him. He replied that Hao should initially pay for his broken phone and then kneel down in front of him and apologize. Tsu decided to intervene in the conversation, saying that he dared not demand it. But as she stepped back, she twisted her foot on a rock sticking out of the ground and sat down, grabbing her leg in pain. For the moment, Hao and the bulky man were distracted by her. Afterward, however, the man told her not to make trouble for herself and just stay out of it, which clearly didn't please Jen, who rushed to defend her in turn, telling him to stay away from Tsu and knocked his hand away, which made the bulky man angry, noting that Hao had decided to play hero for nothing. But Jen was extremely confident and stood with a menacing look in front of him. At this time, Yanzi tried to stop Hao by saying that cultivator, which was about level 2, and he was no match for it. She tried to pull Gianni away by her blouse, but he unhooked her arm and said quite confidently that he could handle it himself, saying she had nothing to worry about and everything would be fine, which Tsu clearly doubted. She looked sadly at Hao, showing with her whole appearance that this was a bad idea. Behind everything that was happening, Lei Rui was watching with a smile on his face, sitting on the roof of one of the buildings, realizing that Hao wouldn't be able to defeat a level 2 cultivator even if he had luck on his side. Gromila meanwhile called Juyu and asked him what exactly he needed to do. Lei replied that it was his duty to crush this guy, and not to touch the girl in any way. Naturally, Rui promised him a reward for solving the problem called Hao Ren. The thug said he understood and hung up, telling Hao that he was letting him play hero. Jen replied that there was no need for that, and he could enjoy the advantage by suggesting that the bulky man catch up with him, and started running away from him. The big guy said he was an overconfident little brat, adding that even if he kneels down now and begs for mercy, it won't help him. The thug got off the ground and jumped forward, which Hao noticed and stopped. Thus he flew past Jen and landed on the ground, noting that he's a pretty fast runner, but that doesn't do him any good either. Hao realized that the bulky man was stronger than him, and fighting one-on-one he would not be able to defeat him. Plus Z had an injured leg, and he can't run away because he won't leave Yanzi in trouble. He scrutinized the pillar of dust, looking for the big guy, who soon showed up. Running out of the dusty mist, Hao prepared himself. The angry thug was rushing towards Jen, saying that he was about to get what he deserved. However, he was too slow and our hero easily dodged his blow, and the big man literally flew into the building, which crumbled as a result. From which Jen was shocked, realizing that he could destroy such a large building with just one blow. But the advantage in speed and agility was definitely on Hao's side. The huge boogeyman emerged unharmed from the structure he had broken. He urged Jen to stop running from him and dodging him, and come out to fight like a real man. Hao prodded him in every way possible, saying that the building couldn't move, unlike him, which he succeeded in doing, as the big man fell for his provocations, and tried again to hit Jen, who again dodged. The angry thug began waving his arms again, hoping to catch up with the nimble Hao, but it was all in vain. He wasted his energy, never hitting once. While he was catching his breath, Jen pondered a plan of further action. Because he still needed to be defeated in some way, a thought suddenly occurred to him, to the realization of which he promptly proceeded, running away from him again. Hao offered the boogeyman to catch him. Our hero was running around the evil thug, which put him in a stupor. He wondered why Ren had started running in circles, thinking the man had lost his mind. Hao ignored him in every way possible, and continued to wind circles around the big guy. At a certain point, the dust got too much, and the big guy started saying he couldn't see anything. Jen, in turn, advised him to knock him down with his strongest punch. The cocky, bulky man said he would definitely do that, especially since he had asked him to do it. He immediately rushed into the pillar of dust, intending to knock Hao off his feet. Jen, in turn, prepared to face the extremely stupid boogeyman, who was already halfway to him and was hoping for his quick victory as he underestimated Hao. He literally flew into the smog of dust, unaware of what awaited him there. Jen immediately put his foot out, the bulky man tripping over it safely. With that, turning Hao around, he hurriedly used his abilities, which Z had taught him. Jen maintained a balance of softness and hardness to utilize the way of controlling water. After which, sparking with energy, he stabbed at the back of the big man, who clearly didn't expect this turn of events. He had an extremely frightened expression on his face. After all he saw in front of him was the concrete wall he'd flown into by inertia. Having literally stuck his head into her, he could no longer continue fighting Hao. Lei Rui was disappointed to realize that his plan had failed miserably. A joyful Ren ran up to Z, saying that he was still able to defeat the big man. She remarked that it was because of her method. Lei was sure that Hao wouldn't be able to control the spirit concentration scroll. Ren took the disgruntled Yanzi in his arms. She said she could walk on her own, but Hao insisted, saying she had twisted her leg and it would be better if he carried her. No matter how nasty Z was, she couldn't remain indifferent to his concern for her. Hao continued to carry her on his back. She noticed that he was too weak because he hadn't reached the second level yet, adding that she took the time to take him to the Greenstone Mountain. Suddenly, Hao stopped and asked Z if she wasn't the one who suggested this trip. She immediately asked him to forget about what she had said to him. Zhen smiled sweetly back at her. The next day, Hao went to the stadium to run to keep in shape, with Yujia watching from the sidelines. Zhen often ran in the stadium to keep in shape, and today was no exception. CE liked to watch him run, for in this way she was close to him. After a while, he finished his training, and Yujia left just like that. Walking through the streets of the city, he continued to study spirit concentration, where the next step was to clear his mind. It was necessary to close one's eyes and breathe with a pure mind. The air passing through the sky awakens the earth. Needing to inhale and hold his breath, at this point, he bumped into someone because he was too engrossed in reading. The unknown guy asked if his name was Hao Ren. He responded positively, asking what he could do for him. A tall guy in a basketball uniform asked him if it was true that Miss Su had called him into her office. Hao replied that it was because he didn't listen to her in class, realizing that he had met another fan of Miss Su. The basketball player remarked that he was lucky, as he was the first student to be in her office, and he was even jealous of him. Jen smiled at him and said that he was in too much of a hurry, because they were already waiting for him. But the guy wouldn't let it go, saying you can't talk to high school students like that, adding that it was extremely rude of him. He arrogantly looked at Hao, who didn't understand what was wrong. At this moment, Yujia ran up, shouting out his name, Huang Shujie. Panting, he demanded an explanation from him, asking what the problem was. And why is he hitting on Hao? Huang as well as Ren were surprised by her appearance. Shuji inquired who she was and her relationship with him. Yujia immediately replied that she was Hao's classmate. At this time, Ren suddenly grabbed her arm and took her behind her back, saying he's fine and there's no need to worry about him. Juan exclaimed enthusiastically, saying it was her, as if he knew C. Zhen and Yujia didn't understand what was going on or what his reaction meant. Shujie said he saw her often at the stadium and she watches Hao run, putting her in a rather awkward position in front of Zhen. Juan resented the fact that he was being chased by such a beautiful girl, and Miss Su also called him into the office. After which, he walked closer to Yujia and leaned towards her and asked, "Why is she so obsessed with this Hao, and what is it about him that someone else isn't?" Such behavior was not to Zhenyu's liking, who urged him to behave decently with the girl. Then threw a punch which Shuji dodged. Hao demanded him to apologize to her. Huang smilingly interrogated him if Ren definitely wanted him to apologize. He offered him a competitive moment, and if Hao won he would apologize to Yujia. Zhen clarified exactly what it was necessary to compete with him in. Z began to realize that it was not for the good. Huang said that field day is coming up and he is participating in the 1,500-meter race, and if Hao wins, he will apologize to them. In front of the entire campus, but if he loses, she'll lick his shoes in front of everyone. Zhen didn't think long enough to agree to his terms, which Z was literally horrified by. Senior Shuiji hurriedly left, saying that they would meet on the field soon. Yuji asked him why he agreed to this. Hao replied that he didn't see a problem with it, asking her if he was really that strong. Z replied that this Shuji is the vice captain and ace on their school's basketball team, and it would be difficult for Ren to defeat him. Hao in turn stood his ground, saying that he should make Huang apologize to her. Z replied that she didn't care who said what about her. Zhen decided to ask her if it was true that she regularly watches him run around in the stadium. She said it was just a coincidence and she was just passing by when she saw him. Hao realized that it wasn't really true, and she was probably really watching him. Yujia decided to confess something to him. She called out to Hao. He in turn turned to her. Looking into her eyes, he looked forward to what C was going to tell him. She said shyly that she really enjoyed watching him run. After a certain time, the day of sport came, and Juan's name was shouted from the stands. Shuiji took the baton, and lightning fast he overtook all of his opponents. The female half of the stands literally went crazy for Juan, screaming his name. In the end, Shuiji predictably won the race, arriving first at the finish line. Yujia swept up that he was indeed very fast, and he had amazing strength, which was inherent to the ace of the basketball team. Hao added that he's tall, handsome, yet rich to everything else. Z smiled and asked Ren if he was jealous of Shuji. Hao broke away from the warm-up and asked who she was going to cheer for in this race. Yujia confidently replied that of course she would cheer for him. Sama realized that Juan was a pretty good-looking and successful guy. Hao thought she was just another fan of this basketball genius, which is what he told her. Naturally, Sei pretended otherwise. She handed him the water bottle, noting that he wasn't thinking about the right thing, Afterward, hustled him off to go and get a good warm-up before an important race. He was extremely pleased that Yuji was showing concern towards him. He was about to go out on the treadmill to stretch, but at that moment a woman's voice called out to him. Hao turned around and saw that it was Z, whom he had never expected to see here, who was running to meet him. Jen immediately inquired of her what she was doing here. She replied cheerfully that she had come to watch him run, and stroked his head in a friendly way, which was not very pleasing to Sei, who in turn sped up and headed towards them. Then they got to know each other, and Yuji noticed that she was quite a pretty girl. Yanzi said that Z was prettier than her, assuming she was Hao's girlfriend, which Yuji asked. Z, in turn, replied that she was just his classmate. Yanzi said that she saw Yuji handing Hao Ren a bottle of water. Z immediately replied that she was the head elder. As such, she was taking care of her classmates. Hao felt out of place, realizing that Z was a devil and anything could be expected from her. Jen literally felt a sense of unease. The girls continued to chat sweetly amongst themselves. They exchanged compliments. Z said she was very kind. Z said they must be very close to Hao. Then, Yanzi moved closer to Yuji. Ren realized that she was already up to something not so good. Zai was literally whispering to Z about how Hao actually had one little secret. Yuji was extremely curious to know his secret, because this way she could become even closer to Ren. Hao was covered in sweat, and began to listen to what Tsu was telling her. It was as if she was playing on his nerves on purpose, and she could see his reaction. Z was in anticipation, and eagerly wanted to know his innermost secret. Little Devil Tsu said Hao is actually engaged, from which Yuji was simply shocked and couldn't believe it. Jen was not himself, and hurriedly denied the engagement information, telling her not to listen to her nonsense. But Tsu didn't stop there and decided to stretch the pleasure. She said with a smile on her face that Hao's fiancé was rather uncomplicated. Yuji still couldn't get used to the idea of him having another girl. At that moment, a loudspeaker announced the beginning of the race for 1,500 meters and asked the participants to get ready. Nervous Hao said he should go. Pleased with herself, Z wished him luck. An extremely frustrated Z looked at him sadly and told him to go get ready for the race. A few seconds later, the start of the men's 500-meter race was announced. Huang in turn immediately surged forward, Hao staying behind several contestants. The girls in the stands began to actively support the basketball player. One of them said that she heard him arguing with a certain Hao. The other said confidently that this Zhenyu would never be able to defeat Shujie. Meanwhile, Hao slowly but steadily ran on the treadmill, knowing full well that he would have to work hard to overtake Huan, whom he saw ahead of him. Just a short time later, Jen went to overtake one of the competitors. Yuji and Z watched the competition intently amidst the screaming maidens, who were still shouting his name. Yanzi said that Hao wouldn't lose and should just wait a bit. Jen decided to overtake the others from the outside lane because he needed the win. Consequently, he greatly increased his speed and began to go around one by one. The loudspeaker said that Hao was really strong, and from 5th place he moved up to 2nd place. An overjoyed Z shouted out that Ren was in 2nd place already and was getting close to Shuji. Z also smiled but refrained from commenting, just observing what was happening. Hao managed to significantly reduce the distance between him and Huang. Shuji in turn turned around for a second and saw Jen trying his best. At the same moment, the ace from the basketball team sped up even more. What was said over the loudspeaker, Zeus realized that he needed to maximize his distance with Hao. The race was coming to an end, and with just the last turn before the finish line, his friends began to support Jen more actively. Hao realized that Huang was very fast, and there wasn't much time left and needed to increase his speed. Shuji turned around and smilingly told Zhenyu that he'd better think about licking his shoes. Z began to shout from the podium. Realizing that this was the crucial moment, Yuji urged her to be careful, since she leaned over leaning on the railing and could fall. Hao thought it was easier said than done. He was absolutely certain he would win the race, aided by his ability. Jen began to feel the moisture in the air, and turned it into power. He closed his eyes, repeating about the shapeless and the formless, thus creating an invisible image. As a result, used a way to control water and thus control ki. His body instantly became much lighter because every method had something in common. Hao's eyes blazed with blue magic, and he began to move much faster than before. Yanzi noticed that he was engaging spiritual energy and was making an instantaneous breakthrough. Jen was rapidly getting closer to the basketball genius. He was as if he was lighter than the wind, which in turn Shujie noticed and was puzzled. Huang didn't understand how Hao managed to catch up with him. After all, there were about 100 meters to the finish line. He was determined to win, thinking that Jen still wouldn't be able to overtake him. Hao realized that he still lacked speed and needed to become even lighter, because he needed victory at any cost and he couldn't lose in front of Yuji. Literally a moment later, Ren had already leveled up with the basketball player Shujie. The one in turn was shocked by Hao's speed and tried his best to overtake him. However, Ren was a few centimeters ahead of Huang and reached the finish line first. And finally he crossed the finish line. With a sense of accomplishment, Hao rejoiced like a child at his victory and exhaled in relief. Shuji, on the contrary, was extremely depressed about losing. He said that it couldn't be, and that it was impossible. The stands were flooded with tears from the girls, while Yujia and Z hugged and cheered at Hao's victory. Yanzi hurried Z immediately go and congratulate the winner Jen. Yujia suddenly stopped her. Z didn't understand what was wrong and looked at her in surprise. Z anxiously asked if it was true that Hao was engaged to someone, or if she was lying since he was still a student. Z realized that she cared about the topic, saying that she had no need to worry about it so much. Wondering what Sei would do if it turned out to be true, Yujia lowered her sad eyes and said that she would congratulate him in that case. In response, Z laughed out loud and hurriedly reassured the distressed girl. Smiling, she advised her not to take everything so seriously, after which, hurried her to go to Hao's place, nudging her in the back and down the stairs. In fact, Z was not very pleased to hear this, and she even became jealous. Walking up to Ren, Z said that he did a good job today. Yanzi added that it wasn't bad. Hao took a proper breath and looked at them. Then he remembered about Haon, and asked the girls to wait for him while he went to get the basketball player. After a few seconds, he leisurely walked over to the tired Shujie, who was literally on his knees. Hao said he was obligated to fulfill part of their pact, and immediately apologized to Yujia. She yanked Ren's shirt, trying to stop him. The basketball ace huffed, and rather grudgingly apologized to Z, after which, immediately ran away in an unknown direction. He had a feeling of hatred towards Hao, thinking that this wasn't over and he'd get back at him if he had to. A satisfied Ren turned to Yujia and said that he had kept his promise. Z blushed and thanked Hao, smiling sweetly back at him, which clearly didn't please little Z, who made a characteristic displeased sound. Our hero turned his attention to her. She said that he finally remembered her too. Hao replied that he always remembered her, and hurriedly expressing his gratitude to her. Z, in the posture of a hurt girl, replied that without her, he would not have succeeded. Z said they're having a holiday party soon, and invited Z. She mumbled inaudibly that if she was invited, she would come. Watching everything going on as always was Lei Rui, who understood, which as much as he hated to admit it, he had really underestimated Hao. After all, he had already reached the second level. After a while, it was evening. At one of the bars in town, they all gathered together to celebrate Hao's victory in the race. Whereupon his friend immediately raised a toast and they had a nice conversation and a good time. One of the friends said he knew how fast Ren could run, but didn't think he could beat Huang. Another remarked that it was all because of the power of love, and asked Hao why he was surrounded by such beautiful girls. Puzzled, Yujia and Yanzi pretended not to hear anything. Jen replied rather modestly that he was just very lucky. At that moment, a gang of unknown hooligans broke into the bar. One of them walked closer to Hao and asked if they were the same Jen. He frowned and replied that it didn't matter, and none of their business. The bully said that winning the race made him overconfident. Z interceded and said that it wasn't their house to break in uninvited. CE realized they were members of the basketball team. Hao said that their ace had just lost to him in a race, hinting that they were no match for him. The bully replied that he was unlucky this time. After a while, they all went to the basketball court together. One of the basketball players said he needed to score 1 point so that no one would say he was bullying him later. A huge basketball player came out to Hao with a ball in his hand, urging him to play with him. Jen indicated, if he wins then they will not bother him and friends again in the future. Gromila handed him a basketball. Hao's friend remarked that he absolutely could not play basketball. Meanwhile, Yujia, realizing that Ren could really lose this time, pulled out her phone and texted someone asking them to come over immediately. Boogie stood in front of Hao and prepared to keep his defenses up near the ring. Suddenly, they were announced the start of the contest. Zhen instantly rushed towards the ring, where he was naturally already waiting for the big man, who immediately realized that as a beginner, he was not bad. Hao in turn tried to get around him to put the ball in the basket. It wasn't an easy task, however, which he realized when he faced the thug. He didn't give Zhenyu the opportunity to get around him and make his way to the ring. Hao realized that normal dribbling wouldn't help here, and he had to think of something. After all, he was like a mountain that couldn't just be taken and walked around. At this point, Hao showed quite convincingly that he was going to throw the ball into the basket. Boogie thought he was relying on luck after he realized he didn't stand a chance, and already prepared to put up a barrier, but our cunning hero rushed to bypass him. But even here, he was met with a catch from a bulky man who wouldn't let him put the ball in the ring, told him not to underestimate him, and hurriedly knocked the ball out of his hands. You have to give credit to the dimensional big man who still managed to clear the ball. Hao in turn used his super ability, realizing that he wouldn't be able to stop him. The ball meanwhile bounced off the ring and flew sideways. The boogeyman thought he had blocked it, after which he reached for the ball, but suddenly Hao jumped high. Having thus regained control of the ball for himself, the bulky man was perplexed. Zhen, with his non-working left hand, tried to put the ball in the basket. What he still managed to do in the end, everyone was shocked. One of them said he jumped back and scored with his weak arm, adding that ordinary people can't do that. At that moment, a basketball flew into him with great speed, which hit him right in his goofy head and ricocheted off to the side. After which he collapsed to the floor. The trainer suddenly appeared and said that he was giving people trouble again. What Jen clearly didn't expect, the coach in turn turned his attention to him. A joyful Yujia ran up to Hao and said that she didn't know how good he was at basketball, adding that he jumped so high like a god. She said they could have fun and she had to go home, so Jen said he'd walk her home since it was getting late. Hao asked why she was angry because he had not disgraced her, but rather won, and Z said that Z would be alone in that case. Ren muttered that they were just friends with Yujia, nothing more. I asked Sue if she was jealous, to which her response didn't take long. She's like a madwoman and fists at him, saying he's talking nonsense, and she's not jealous of him at all. The next day at school, in Miss Sue's office, where she called Hao again. Jen didn't understand what was going on, or why she had summoned him again. Han leaned her palm on his stomach at this moment and said that he had reached the second level, after noting that this was a pretty good result for him. Then it was as if she had generated something. It glowed red in her hand. Miss Sue said she would give him this necklace, which has a special property and it will help him hide his aura. Hao immediately put it around his neck while feeling an incomprehensible feeling. Jen shimmered with magic. Sue explained that this amulet absorbed his excess energy, allowing it to move into his body, adding that it would work for 1 month, and in that time frame, Hao is required to reach the 3rd level, the other inspectors at the sight of him will question him. Also at the 3rd level, his 108 acupuncture points would be revealed when he would make a breakthrough. And people with weak wills can die or get badly hurt. Miss Sue recommended cultivating him until Hao felt it. What Jen immediately began to do, it was as if he had perked up. His energy essence was showing itself in full force. Hao closed his eyes and proceeded to cultivate while absorbing a large amount of energy. Miss Sue has noticed that he's pretty good at it and he knows what to do. Suddenly, he was interrupted by the phone ringing. Hao saw that his neighbor Mr. Zhang was calling him, of which he informed Miss Han and immediately picked up the phone. The neighbor told Hao that his grandmother had fallen and passed out, and he needed to come home immediately. Jen was shocked by this news. He began to remember his beloved grandmother. How, as a child, children had laughed at him and bullied him, and all he could do in response was weep. They shamelessly told him that no one needed him in this world. And Hao was proving to them that the parents would be here soon. They retorted by saying that no parents leave their children for a few years. Then the angry grandmother would come running and disperse the heartless kids. Jen in turn cried about it all the time, and his grandmother tried to calm him down in every possible way. She said she would always be there for him, and wouldn't leave him in trouble no matter what happened. Grandma always tried to cheer up her grandson by cooking something delicious. Once again, she made his favorite fried chicken for dinner. But Hao was cranky, and said he wanted his mom and dad back, not the chicken. In doing so, he banged on the table, causing the food to scatter and the plate to break. In response, his grandmother did not scold him because she understood what he was experiencing, and children should grow up in a wholesome family. He sat crying and watched as she silently picked up the shards of the broken plate, along with the food. The grandmother in turn tried to reassure Hao, saying that his parents would definitely return. Jen calmed down in a moment, and asked again if they were really coming to see him. In response, Grandma angrily said she would beat them if they didn't come home. Hao fell back into despair, sobbing even more as he really wanted to at least see them. He ran the arms of his grandmother, who kept repeating that she would always be with him, even if they didn't come. From these sad memories, Jen had a sudden tremor. He literally vomited blood at this moment. Miss Sue became worried. She said mood swings shouldn't happen that quickly. Hao covered himself with the hand through which the blood was oozing, and replied that he was obliged to save his grandmother. Jen instantly called an ambulance to his home address, which was already on its way, but due to the traffic jam created on the bridge, could not get there. The ambulance driver called Hao, saying that because of the accident on the bridge, he would only be able to get to him in an hour while the road was cleared. Enraged, Jen thought that the problems were being dumped on him one after another on purpose. He began to hastily consider how to help his grandmother in the shortest possible time. Hao decided not to hesitate and call Mrs. Hongyu because he had no one else to turn to. But as luck would have it, her number didn't answer, being out of range. Then he wrote her a message asking her to help him get to the hospital with his grandmother, explaining the whole situation. After which he rushed to run home to his grandmother's house, but Mrs. Hongyu answered his message, writing that she would pick up his grandmother herself and asked him to go to Eastern City Hospital. After a while, Hao reached the necessary hospital. Literally flying in the door, he demanded to know where the elderly woman who had just been admitted was. He scared the whole ward. The doctor told him what room his grandmother was in. Hao immediately headed there. Nervously swinging the doors open, he called out to his grandmother. But she was lying on the bed unconscious. Jen slowly approached her. Seeing her in such a pitiful state, he let a manly tear fall. Trying his best to ward off bad thoughts, Hao didn't take his eyes off her. On the next bunk lay Z, who asked him not to worry so much, and that I shouldn't have woken her up because she needs to rest now. Half an hour before Hao's grandmother was taken to the hospital, Lei and Yanzi hurriedly drove her in their car to the hospital. Tsu said she must have hit her head when she fell, as she was bleeding from her forehead, and they might not be able to get her there alive in time. Tsu said about using her powers to help her. She brought her palm enveloped in magic to her grandmother's head. Lei said she couldn't use her powers without the dragon core. Tsu replied that she owed it to her to help her now, because every second was worth its weight in gold right now. Suddenly, the wound on Grandma's forehead began to slowly heal. Yanzi heaved a sigh of relief and said that she was healing. But after a few seconds, Z began to be covered in sweat and her eyes began to darken. She eventually lost consciousness. Jui was shocked by what happened and rushed to the hospital. Lei was in the room next to her and sadly said that Miss Z had saved Grandma Hao's life. Adding that she was too weak without a dragon core, Tsu asked him to shut up. But Chui went on to talk about how Miss Z even fainted during her grandmother's healing. Yanzi said her mom was in the kitchen and didn't see his message, and she actually read it. Hao realized that Z had really helped his grandmother and didn't know how to thank her. It wasn't as if Jen couldn't match two different people. One was a little devil and the other turned out to be a savior. Grandma woke up. Hao took her hand and told her that thanks to Tsu, she had survived and was feeling better. She pulled herself up and turning toward Yanzi thanked her, saying that she is very sweet and kind, adding that Tsu will be a wonderful wife. Jen laughed and said she wasn't kind but a little devil, which resulted in a disapproving look from his grandmother. Hao realized that he was clearly not a priority in this situation, and it was better to remain silent. After a while, Hao went in search of little Yanzi. He wandered in thought around the schoolyard where all the students were having carefree fun, saddened to realize that in some ways he has aged a bit. Jen walked down the hallway looking around, but Z was nowhere to be found. As he walked past the students, he heard two guys discussing her. Hao listened, one of them saying that she was rather impatient, while the other remarked that he didn't care about her temperament. And dreaming of her becoming his girlfriend, Jen realized how popular Z was. He went to the door to the classroom and knocked, saying he needed to pick up Yanzi. The teacher opened the door and said she hadn't seen him before, wondering who he was to her. Hao replied that he was her brother, and her parents asked him to take her away. The teacher said she had to be on the tennis court and asked her to give something to Tsu, saying that Zhao Yanzi is spending too much time with one boy, due to which she has a certain problem in the form of puppy love. Hao immediately went to the tennis court to look for Z. Remembering the teacher's words about the love letters addressed to Zai and about her seeing a high school student, Jen realized that she might not be happy about his presence, as it would interrupt her time with her boyfriend, but he wanted to say thank you for saving his grandmother. As he approached the court, he heard someone calling her name. Looking closer, Hao saw Yanzi playing tennis with the guys, to whom they were so diligently writing out compliments, but she paid no attention to them. After the game was over, Z stopped to drink water. Zhenyu wondered who this lucky guy was that she was spending so much time with. He even became a little jealous. At this point, she was approached by some young guys, one of whom remarked that she was pretty good, and offered her a few more rounds, but Yanzi haughtily replied that she was too busy. The girl standing next to Hao said that all the high school students were hitting on Z, even though she had a boyfriend. Jen saw the guys start to talk her into playing with them one more time, saying that playing tennis can't hurt her in any way, urging her not to be so serious, which extremely displeased our hero, as a result of which Hao moved closer and grabbed one by the arm, saying he just had time to play tennis with them. Tsu wondered what he was doing here. Ren asked Yanzi, giving him literally 10 minutes, after which he would walk her home. The guys agreed to play a few rounds with him. Hao took a stance and urged them to get ready, then tossed a tennis ball in the air. They thought they were ready to serve it. Our hero in turn struck as hard as possible, realizing that they would not be able to react to him. The ball rebounded off their zone and literally slammed into the wall, causing cracks to go down the wall. The guys were shocked at its power. They said he was just bullying the weak and that it wasn't fair. Hao replied that in that case, they should admit defeat and never molest Z again. He then smilingly made his way towards her and offered to walk her home. She told him not to get cocky just from helping her. Hao replied that he was just passing by and decided to help her get rid of the molesters. He only annoyed the already angry Yanzi, and she started to throw herself at him, saying that she had the urge to take him to the Dragon Palace. But at the moment, she changed her mind. Ren chased after her, asking her to show him this palace. Z smilingly ran away from him. After a certain amount of time, Yanzi naturally took him to the famous palace, where it was really very beautiful. She led him along a road lined with knights in golden armor. One of them greeted Z, addressing her, "Your Majesty," from which Hao was puzzled, but realized that she was still the daughter of the Dragon King. Suddenly, a large, creepy flower stood in front of him, opening its petals like a maw. Jen was naturally frightened. Then a huge beast that looked like a lion with deer antlers and a dragon tail appeared in front of them. He crouched down in front of Yanzi. She in turn stroked him. A moment later, Hao was blinded by a spotlight that shone from the side of the palace. An old man came out and fell on his knees and greeted Her Highness in the person of Z. Hao didn't particularly like this attitude of everyone towards this little devilish. Zai asked the elder to give him a tour of the palace as she needed some sleep. He naturally agreed to show all of Hao's charms and asked to follow him. They, after a short interval, found themselves in front of the gate of one of the palaces. Ren asked what kind of building it was. The old man replied that they were in the Ice Palace, which was a prison for lawbreakers. Upon entering the palace, Hao noticed the huge ice boxes that had frozen people inside. The old man swept that no one would be able to get out of the palace. Jen walked over to one of them and touched the icy surface with his hand. Literally seconds later, cracks went down the ice. As a result, the ice capsule shattered into shards. Hao didn't realize what was happening. An unknown fairy-like girl fell out of it. The elder was also shocked by what had happened. He asked Jen how he managed to destroy the ice, assuming his energy was rather unusual. The elder asked him to stay where he was and to keep his eyes on her, while he in turn reports to his majesty what has happened. The girl asked Hao if he was the one who freed her from the ice capsule. Jen replied that he had gotten it by accident and didn't mean to call her out. She thanked him for keeping her alive and called herself Lu Lilin. At that moment, another fairy girl flew in and asked in surprise how Lilin had managed to get out, saying that no one from the heavenly world must know of her escape. Lu assumed that they must have forgotten about them by now, because it had been a long time. She said that they were maids in the heavenly world, and she was sentenced to 200 years because of infiltrating the human world. They hugged the other fairy, saying they never expected to meet again. Hao hurried them to get out of here quickly as they might be seen. Then they'll imprison her back in the ice capsule, and they may never get another chance like this again. Lilin said he was also in danger because he released a criminal without a warrant. Hao decided to take them to the Dragon King Zhao Guang himself and tell them how everything happened. He sat on his fancy throne and glared menacingly at Jen. Hao just started his narration as Guang interrupted him with his unrestrained laughter. Jen was surprised. Zhao said that he forgot to release those fairies since a petition had already come, adding that the son-in-law had done a good job. Our hero clearly didn't expect such a reaction from the Dragon King, and neither did the fairy girls, who nestled into Hao's side and began to thank him profusely, calling him their savior. At this moment, a sleepy Z came out to them, stating that they were being too noisy, causing her to be unable to sleep. Yanzi looked around at everyone with her gaze and turned her attention to Hao, who was literally enveloped in the arms of the fairy girls, which made Tsu furious, stating that Jen had no right to do such a thing in the Dragon Palace. Realizing how things looked from the outside, Hao hurriedly explained everything to Yanzi, which in turn was, to put it mildly, not in the mood. Jen didn't know how, at this moment, to get out of the situation. The elder told him that Z's birthday was next month, so he advised Hao to buy her a present. Jen immediately went to the shopping malls, looking for a suitable gift. He watched the people who seemed to know exactly what they wanted to buy and ran around the stores. Hao also went through a few stalls, but still didn't find anything suitable. Then a thought occurred to him. Since Z has trouble with English, he decided to give her a couple reference books. He began to run his hand over the books, thinking to buy them all to express his sincerity to her. At that moment, he met the gentle hand of a girl who was also picking out books on that shelf. When he turned around, he saw Yujia, who was surprised to see him, and she was also surprised to see him. Smiling and saying it was an incredible coincidence, she fixed her hair as usual. They bought up and hurried out of the store, where they were thanked by a polite saleswoman. Hao and Xie Yujia decided to sit in a cafe for a while and chat over a cup of coffee. He told her he was looking for a birthday present for Z. After all, she was his student, and I wanted to give her something worthwhile. Z asked to see what he had chosen as a gift for her. Hao smiled and proudly displayed his English reference books and asked Yujia's opinion. She was shocked by such a gift, saying it wasn't appropriate. As a result, she immediately took him to a women's store. Where Ren noticed the women trying on bracelets and rings, Z said that the girls liked cute things. Hao started carrying potential gifts to her, to Yujia's approval. The first was a soft toy in the shape of a rabbit. Z said it wasn't what Z needed. Then he brought out an unsightly necklace that also didn't fit as a gift. Jen walked over to the counter with the rings and bracelets and noticed an unusual piece under the display case. It was a beautiful ring, and most importantly, it was in the shape of a little smiling devil. Hao realized it was perfect for a birthday gift, and just her style. Remembering how she constantly wanted to boss him around, but still, she was nice sometimes. Plus, Yanzi helped Zhenyu when needed and saved his grandmother. Satisfied with himself, he twirled the ring he'd chosen in his hands, at which point Z called out to him. He proudly showed her what he had chosen. Yujia's face literally changed. She asked if he really wanted to give her the ring. Jen replied that it was quite nice. Would be a good gift for Z. Z said it was really cute, but it was a gift for a bride or his girlfriend, but not for a student. Hao agreed with her, thinking about the fact that he didn't consider her as a bride since she was still a child. He said he'd give her some kind of stuffed toy. He took the bear in his hands and showed it to Yujia to see what she thought about it. Z in turn remarked that he was worrying too much about it. Hao replied without thinking that Yanzi was his future, and before he finished he realized that he had almost said something that Z couldn't know. But Yujia was already wary, and looked extremely worried. Our hero was sweating in a moment, worried that she might have figured it all out. Ren hurriedly rephrased, saying that Yanzi is the future sacrificer of this world, and laughed naively. Yujia found this joke very funny and modestly giggled in response. After a while, they left the store with a large teddy bear. Polite Hao said that he took up Z's time. She kindly replied that it was okay. Yujia had made a point that if he really wanted to thank her, he could go out with her. After a while, he and Yujia stood in a long line. Z ran with a lot of books in her hands, and shouted that her Adol lectures were very popular. A surprised Hao never would have thought she had her own Adols, which he told her. Adding that Yujia was always so serious in school, and turned out to be a fan too. She's savvy that they are the most famous Chinese scientists in the world, and everyone is following their project they are working on. Hao wondered if her Adols were academics. Z replied that they were academics at a young age. So engrossed in the story of her Adols, Yujia didn't look where she was going at all. And clinging over the threshold, she was falling, but our hero managed to react in time. Hao grabbed her arm, thus preventing her from finally falling to the ground, after which he pulled Yujia towards him. Everything happened so fast that she didn't have time to be frightened. How in a second she was already safe in the form of Zhen's embrace, which in turn pressed her against him, which was extremely pleasing to say. Then they began to quickly pick up the scattered books from the ground. Picking up one of them, Hao began to scrutinize the cover. He looked extremely surprised at the portrait drawn on the book. Yujia hurried him at this moment because the lecture was about to start soon. Zhen, naturally trying to please her, followed her into the hall, where they settled into their seats, and Z listened to the lecture fascinatingly. Hao was of the opposite opinion. Zhen was literally bored as he wasn't really interested, but he realized he had promised her. After a while, they stood together for the autographs of the scholars. Hao gaped at the moment, and Z noticed that he had slept through the entire lecture. And as hard as it was to get those tickets, Zhen decided to sit on a chair waiting for their turn to come up. What Yujia was clearly unhappy about, he realized that he hadn't slept well because of his training, and apologized to her, saying he'd get her an autograph himself. Z noted that he's been sleepy lately. Hao tried his best to calm her down by smiling back, at which time it was his turn. Our hero immediately held out the book for an autograph, asking for permission from Idol Se. The girl was shocked by Zhen's appearance. She looked at him with sad eyes, and could only utter his name. Meanwhile, Yujia ran up to them and said that she was a big fan of theirs, but they paid no attention to her, staring dumbfoundedly at Hao. Z asked him when he had time to meet them and if he knew them. Zhen's face changed in a moment, and turning away from them, he headed in the other direction, saying that he didn't know them. The man picked up on the fact that Hao still couldn't forgive them, which was a problem. Yujia didn't understand at all what was going on, and why suddenly Zhen became so unfriendly. Z stopped him and asked her Adols if she and Hao shared the same ancestors, since they had the same last name. The woman thanked Yujia for attending their lectures and asked if Hao's boyfriend was hers. Z didn't hesitate to answer. While he's not her boyfriend, the woman replied that in the future that means he'll be her boyfriend. Z said that's not what she meant. Hao in turn was puzzled at the direction the conversation had taken, and what Z had said. Yujia bowed to her Adols, and after thanking them for everything, said goodbye to them, after which she abruptly pulled Zhen, who didn't understand what was going on. The scientist looked wistfully after them and no less sadly summarized that their poor son was neglected, and they spent so much effort on research while failing to become real parents. Hao's mom added that seeing him with this friend gave her some relief after a while. They sat down on a park bench, and Yujia sadly said that she didn't even ask them a couple questions, but she saw her Adols. Hao tried to reassure her, saying it was normal, but Z replied that he had no idea how amazing they were. Yujia began to give him their books, imploring him to familiarize himself with their research. At this moment, they were called out by Hao's frightened friend, who hurried them to help Jia Ying, who was fighting with the basketball players, from which Zhen was puzzled, since they had sort of worked things out with them not too long ago. The basketball team, meanwhile, beat up Zhen's friend, urging him not to say it again. Jia Ying replied that even if he asked him 100 times, he would still say that Hao was better than Shujie. They continued to beat him, saying he was being so stubborn for nothing, adding that if he had just admitted defeat, it would have been better for him. Jia Ying in turn tried to fight back and bit one of them on the leg. Making them even angrier, they began to strike harder. Suddenly, Hao shouted out, telling them to stop bullying his friend. The bully replied in a sarcastic manner that he didn't expect to see him here. They gang-headed toward him, saying that if he called an ambulance now, he might live. The beaten Jia Ying asked Zhen to run away as soon as possible to escape them. Hao, however, was determined and reminded them that he had warned them about his friends. To keep them away from him or his loved ones, his hands blazed with magic. Hao immediately began to beat up the insolent scum. He literally went wild with anger and continued to strike the rogue hard. Zhen's eyes were bloodshot, and it seemed like he was only getting angrier by the second, after he brutally beat one of them, almost to the point of unconsciousness. Hao rather confidently headed towards the rest of his abusers, saying that they had pissed him off for nothing. The gang of basketball players stood by worriedly. He remembered Miss Sue's words about his mood swings not being able to pass too quickly. As such, he needed to remain calm, with a cool head, or else he would not survive. At that moment, his heart started to pound faster than usual, and he vomited blood again. In the aftermath, Hao fell to his knees and breathed heavily, trying to regain consciousness. Yuja and his friend didn't understand what was happening to him. They shouted out his name in a frightened manner. The bandits on the basketball team have noticed that he's no longer as cool as he was a minute ago. Then, one of the hooligans kicked Hao, causing him to fall to the ground. The other also began beating the currently defenseless Jen. They, as a whole gang, mercilessly inflicted painful blows on him. The thug in turn lifted Hao above him and threw him against the ground. Yuji realized that it couldn't go on like this as they could kill him, and tried to intervene, but Jen's friends stopped her, saying that they were scumbags and she could get hurt too. Z sadly uttered that there was an urgent need to take some action. Gao Ronghua took off his glasses and hurried to the aid of the battered Zheng, shouting that they were finished and urging them to stop immediately. Ruanghua ran up to one of the bandits and wrapped his arms around him from behind. The one in turn reacted instantly by elbowing him in the face, which brought Hao into action, who lifted his head to see his friend being beaten. Once again, angry, Ren began to slowly rise to his feet, his eyes sparkling with energy. Hao said they let themselves beat up his friends again. The bullies turned their attention to him. The bandit was surprised that he was able to get up and hurriedly sent him to a horizontal position again. However, this time our hero tried to act with a cool head. The bully threw a punch at him. Hao immediately caught his arm, after which he launched a series of powerful attacks into the body of the basketball player, followed by the others, which Jen began beating them furiously, which they clearly didn't expect. Following the thug, Hao hurriedly dispatched the last bandit as well. Jumping high into the air, he kicked him in the head. He instantly assumed a horizontal position. An exhausted Jen stood in the middle of the hooligans he had scattered, as suddenly he felt a strong weakness in his body and fell to his knees. Hao's clothes were covered in blood. He literally began to pound, and it seemed that he was about to lose consciousness. Yuji was shocked by Jen's condition and immediately ran up to him. But at that moment, Miss Han showed up and picked him up with her hands, telling him that he shouldn't be nervous. Z didn't understand where she had gotten here at this hour, and watched in surprise. Miss Su asked her to go get Vice Principal Mr. Liu, while he kept an eye on Hao. Teacher Su began to instantly heal Hao. He lay unconscious as he suddenly began to cough a little. And gradually coming to his senses, Jen slowly opened his eyes, and he saw Teacher Han in front of him, who inquired about his well-being. Hao asked where his friends were. He said they were fine, unlike him, because he almost died, adding that she asked him to try his best to avoid emotional swings. And not only did he disobey her, he beat ordinary people to a pulp. Jen stated quite confidently that he had no regrets, and no one had the right to beat up his friends. Miss Han gave him a wary glance before leaning back in her chair, saying he was a lucky man, but if it happens again, she'll punish him herself. Our hero had no choice but to agree to her terms, which he did, thanking the teacher he wanted to leave the room. But Miss Su said there's a basketball game against Tsinghua University next month, and he'll be in trouble if he beats someone up again. Hao replied that he was responsible for his actions. Han called him naive. After all, they would still cling to his friends. Jen replied that he wouldn't let that happen. He had a temper, and she even liked it. She would never have thought she would need the identity of the princess's fiancé. Hao stood in the hallway outside the basketball team coach's door and pondered what Miss Su had told him. At that moment, a girl called out to him, saying that the coach was inside right now, asking Jen to wait for a couple minutes. Xie Wenjun was a true legend as he made the East Ocean University basketball team quite popular, saying that even the headmaster is forced to treat him with respect. Hao realized that he had to behave himself. At this time, bandaged basketball players were passing by, who called out to him and asked what he was doing here. Assuming that Hao had come to apologize to the principal, Ren tried to ignore them. The most crippled of them all declared that Hao would soon be put behind bars. Jen, in turn, tried to restrain himself in both actions and expressions. The gang did not stop, and in every possible way provoked him to rash actions, saying that he and his friends will be thrown out of school. At a certain point, Hao still couldn't stand it, and was already thinking of pouncing on them. But at this time, Coach Xie Wenjun came out to them and ordered them to shut up. After which, after looking around at everyone, he turned his attention to Jen. The mutilated basketball player began complaining to Mr. C about Hao, saying that he was the one who beat them to such a state. Jen apologized to the coach for beating those people, but they were bothering his classmates. Before he could say anything, Coach Se gave them a slap on the back, and they in turn said he had no right to do that to them. Afterward, he told Hao that these guys wouldn't bother him and his friends anymore. Jen didn't expect such a turn of events, and said that he too had overreacted and shouldn't have beaten them so badly. Mr. Si Wanjun replied that he had nothing to apologize for because he had already received compensation. Meanwhile, old man Lu Qing came out and announced the decision. which the assistant hurriedly put up on the bulletin board. Everyone began to read carefully what it said and what decision they had made. It said the basketball team was being punished, and the actions of Hao and his friends were deemed self-defense, but since the match is on the line, and the team members were injured, Jen will be forced to join the basketball team, which they strongly disagreed with. Hao honestly wasn't thrilled with this news either, but at least he and his friends weren't being punished. In what was undoubtedly a plus, Coach Z looked at Jen and smilingly said that this was his compensation. The next day, Hao went to the gym where the basketball team was practicing. He stood to the side with Zi Wanjun and watched them play. After a few seconds, the coach ordered everyone to line up in front of him, announcing that Hao will now play the role of a heavy forward on their team. Xiuji pointed out that he was only a rookie, and there was no way he could be put as a forward right away. Juan, with a haughty expression on his face, twirling a basketball on his finger, the coach took the ball from him, then threw it far toward the ring, and told Jen to hammer it into the basket. Hao rushed from his seat to the ball, realizing that he couldn't embarrass himself in front of everyone. He ran to the ring pretty fast, and was as focused as possible. The basketball, in turn, hit the ring and flew back toward Jen. Hao pushed himself off the floor and jumped high into the sky for the ball, catching which he headed lightning fast towards the basket, literally hovering in the air. What the team didn't expect from the rookie after a few seconds of flight. Hao still put the ball in the basket, thus finally convincing the team of his abilities. One of the basketball players commented that he has a pretty high jump and good control of his strength. Jen realized that next time he would need to jump from his left foot so that the pose would be more stable. Everyone applauded him, saying that this is the best rookie in the world, naturally besides Xiujie, who, on the other hand, was angry at Hao and couldn't accept that he was on their team. Mr. Si Wanjun asked if anyone had any objections about Jen. In response, everyone remained silent. The coach called out the team's newest player, Hao, to follow him. He took him to the basketball court, which was outside, where to the surprise of our hero, Yuji practiced throwing the ball into the ring. Hao couldn't believe his eyes. He had never seen her in this role before. After a few seconds, Coach Z asked Yuji to come over to him. She instantly turned around and saw Jen with Mr. Si Wanjun. Yuji said hello to them. Mr. Z said it was his little sister who would be his personal trainer for today. Ren was shocked to find out that she was the coach's sister. Z hurried her brother to go to the team, saying she would take care of Hao herself. He asked her if she was really going to teach him how to play basketball. Z replied that after he beat those guys, he started underestimating others, and she's a good player, by the way. They went to the basketball court and Yuji told him to block her, adding that he should duck low and watch his opponent's movements carefully. Yuji stood in front of Hao and kicked the ball against the ground while looking into his eyes. Jen concentrated on her movements as much as possible, however, after a moment. Z tried to go around him with the ball and ended up hitting Hao, who took a step towards her. Jen, in turn, was extremely surprised that she actually knew how to play basketball. From the outside, it might have looked like they were hugging instead of playing. Hao stood a pillar and stared at her. The game stopped at this moment. Lifting her head and looking at him, Yuji noticed that he was doing completely the wrong thing. And in basketball, this is considered a rules violation, hence the hasty change of assignment. Saying that he wasn't doing very well at the moment, Hao naturally agreed. Yuji showed him the technique of throwing the ball into the ring, noting that he should hold the ball with his left hand and push it with his right wrist. And you have to throw the ball with your fingertips, which she demonstrated to him by putting the ball in the basket. Hao said she did well. Z urged him to stay focused and try to quit on his own. Our hero struck a pose, and from behind his back carelessly threw the ball into the basket. But he missed, with the ball stuck between the ring and the guard. Yuji realized that it would be difficult for him. She repeated that she needed to use her wrists and fingers. After a while, there was a meeting with the Hao family at the Dragon King's house. Everyone was gathered around the table, including Jen's parents along with his grandmother. Hao's father remarked that it was extremely hard to believe that such a nice lady had saved his mother's life. Yanzi in turn became shy, and blushing she didn't utter a word. She watched as everyone chatted amiably with each other. Jen's father said that he would like such a sweet and wonderful daughter for himself like Z. Guan replied that he could have such a daughter-in-law. He wanted to drink a glass of alcohol, but Mrs. Hong Yu snatched it from Guan abruptly. Yanzi got bored after a certain amount of time listening to all these luscious favors, and unable to think of anything better to do, she decided to at least have a good meal. At that moment, Jen's mother noticed that Hao already had a girlfriend, who had recently come to their lectures. There was a sepulchral silence at the table. Everyone was shocked and started looking at each other. Yanzi broke her chopsticks out of anger, literally boiling over more and more with each passing second. Hao said that Mom doesn't know what she's talking about, and that girl is just his classmate. But Uncle Z couldn't bear to bang his fist on the table. Everyone turned their attention to him. He declared that Hao was a common catcher who was unworthy of their wonderful Yanzi. Dragon King Guan urged him to immediately calm down and behave himself, apologizing to those present and saying that it was Zhao Kuo, one of his younger brothers who was not very good at choosing words. Uncle Kuo, for his part, tried to keep himself in check, but he couldn't control his facial expression. Yanzi thanked Uncle Quo, saying that he was very kind to her. He finally calmed down and began to smile back at Sue at least a little. She smiled at him the same way, after which she told him that she was in some kind of trouble, which concerned some high school students. Z was silent for a moment as she was uncomfortable talking about it. Then she did say she was molested by high school students. Uncle Quo flared up again, demanding their names from her to deal with the rascals. But Z replied that Hao had already dealt with them quite successfully. Jen, in turn, tried to make as innocent a face as possible. Everyone was silent again for a while, with a stony expression on their faces. Mrs. Hongyu never understood what exactly Ren had done. Hao said that nothing much really happened. Mrs. Hongyu remarked that she had never seen Z stick up for someone like that before. Uncle Quo said that he could also protect her from those scumbags. At this moment, Z gave him a chicken leg, assuring me that it was very tasty meat, trying once again to appease my uncle. Hao watched what was happening and somewhere even began to envy his uncle. Jen risked asking Yanzi, too, for a chicken leg for himself. She turned to him and, crunching the bones of her arms, peculiarly answered, while asking what he wanted. Taking her hint, Hao said that she had imagined it and he didn't want anything. After a while, the Hao family hurried home. In turn, Z and his parents accompanied them. Yanzi apologized to Mr. and Mrs. Hao, and to Grandma Hao for being rude. Grandma said she didn't have to apologize and they should thank her. Jen's father said he would like a daughter-in-law like her, but his mother was of a different opinion and preferred that gentle girl, which she kept silent about. Yanzi stared intently into Hao's eyes. He in turn looked at her the same way. For a while they glanced over as the parents said their goodbyes to each other. Zai then shyly lowered her eyes down. In her hands she held an envelope. At this moment Mrs. Hongyu nudged her, urging Z to approach Zhenyu. She was acting like a child, and hiding her sympathy for Hao in every way possible. They stood opposite each other and were silent after an awkward pause. Yanzi handed him an invitation to her birthday party in an envelope, telling him not to forget it. Then, as befits a child, embarrassed, she simply ran away. Hao looked at the beautifully designed invitation and said he would definitely come. Yanzi stood blushing to the side. Ren waved her hand in response. The next day, Hao went to Miss Han's office, presenting her with a certain bracelet, something she clearly didn't expect him to do, which she told Zhenyu while looking at the beautiful bracelet on her hand. Hao replied that she had helped him many times, and with that story about the basketball team too. Miss Su reminded him of Z's birthday next month, and wondered if Ren had prepared for it. He smiled and proudly announced that he had already bought her a nice gift. The teacher said she was asking him something else entirely, noting that Hao has absolutely no idea what the point really is. She said that the dragons of the 4 ocean clans are the most powerful, and the most powerful of all. But lately they've gotten too caught up in human affairs. In particular, the new generation was not as strong as the previous generation, adding that Yanzi's cultivation level was too low. The West Ocean Dragon Clan is currently gaining strength, and Zheng Yitao, the Crown Prince, is the strongest among the younger generation. They start wars and try to take the place of the East Ocean Dragon Clan, so the two clans are on terrible terms. Jen swept up that he had seen many treasures sent by the Western Ocean Clan in the Dragon Palace. Teacher Han sipped her coffee and said that Hao was too naive. Miss Su added that Zheng Yitao actually wants to marry Yanzi. Ren, at this moment, was also drinking coffee, which he soon choked on when he heard about Yitao's plans. Miss Han said that Z is the sole heiress of the East Ocean Clan, and by marrying her, he will lead their clan. Hao wondered how Mr. Zhao couldn't understand Zheng's intentions. Miss Su said there's nothing he can do since Yitao is openly showing interest in Z, the other princes. They don't dare to propose to her, and besides, Eastern dragons are weaker than Western dragons, so they won't be able to conflict with them as well. The teacher complimented. Everyone was surprised that after Hao accidentally ate Z's core, he was betrothed to her. And at her birthday party, all eyes will be on Jen. But the Western dragons won't give up on their plan, and will pressure Z to marry Zheng Yitao. And that means they are sure to have the support of many elders. Hao asked the teacher if they were going to take Yanzi away forcibly. Miss Han replied that he would most likely be, since Jen's weakness would only benefit them. And if Z marries someone who doesn't know how to cultivate, none of the dragon clans will accept it. Hao said that it turns out he is putting her in danger. Su said that the only chance is to become a cultivator, otherwise they are doomed. Jen replied that he had already reached the 3rd level, and understood how spiritual concentration worked. Miss Han had noticed that even after the 3rd level, his spiritual energy remained too weak for the Kang level. Hao in turn assured Su that he would find a way to reach him, and he would not allow Z to be harmed, no matter what it cost him. A pensive Jen leisurely walked back to his home through the streets of the night city. Suddenly his friend Chao Ronghua appeared behind him and called out to him. Saying that Hao was looking for 2 beautiful girls, Jen turned around, and began to wonder who might be looking for him at this late hour of the night. Our hero naturally went to meet them. The girls turned out to be 2 fairies, whom he had previously saved in the Ice Palace. They took him under their arms and wouldn't let go for a second, Hao begging them to leave him alone. but they were very stubborn and didn't want to leave him, quite the opposite. They asked his permission, always and everywhere, to serve him. At a certain point, Jen still managed to disentangle himself from their embrace. After that, he immediately started running away from them, asking them not to chase him. After running down a few streets and wrapping up behind one of several high-rise buildings, Hao tried to catch his breath, thinking he had finally broken away from those crazy fairies. At that moment, an unknown female voice called out to him, asking if he had asked her to come here. She said the letter he wrote was too corny, and last century it was Wan Lin, the campus beauty of Eastern Ocean University, and her family was second only to Zhao Guang's family in business. Wan began to pose naively, saying she knew how irresistible and popular she was. But she is unavailable to him because she is too good for Hao. Jen in turn understood nothing, and silently absorbed her silly antics. Lin added that she already likes a certain guy anyway, which was Xuan Shujie, the star player of the basketball team. He was tall, rich, and very attractive. Lin literally saw him as her fiancé already. Vanya said that only popular guys like her are worthy of her beauty. At this time, one of Lin's girlfriends looked closely and recognized Hao Ren as him, which she hastened to tell the rather arrogant Wan. She said that because of his love for her, Hao was always harassing Shujie. Jen was literally taken aback, for such nonsense even little Z couldn't think of. Hao was giving her the opportunity to finish this one-actor theater, which Lin did. Throwing away the letter from the unknown person, she looked at Jen haughtily, after which she stomped this letter with her heels and walked closer to Hao, saying she wasn't on his level, and he didn't look up to her either. A few seconds later, Hao was called out by an enthusiastic female voice. Turning around, he saw all the same fairy girls pouncing on him at the same moment. They literally piled him on the ground, saying they had finally found him, then started hugging him and smiling at the already tired of them Hao. Van was shocked to see the two hotties pouncing on him. They in turn continued to rejoice at seeing him, noting that he would not run away now. One of them wondered what was wrong with him because she saw his disgruntled face. Lin and her girlfriend silently watched what was happening. After that, Van still couldn't stand it and asked them the question that had been plaguing her, who they were and what they were doing here. They turned to Lin and looked at her in surprise. Then, as if in unison, they replied that they were Jen's personal maids, and laughed. Hao didn't know what to do with them to influence their decision. The bewildered Van and her friends once again froze in place watching the strange girls. Lin wanted to try to chase them away, but they just ignored her. Hao said he didn't need personal maids, and he was tired of telling them that for the 1,000th time. But the irrepressible fairy maidens tearfully begged him to stay with him, saying that they could help him cultivate. The next morning at Hao's house, where there was a bit of a mess, the alarm clock rang loudly, which naturally woke up Jen, and our sleepy hero lazily got out of bed and headed for the bathroom, where two twin girls were taking showers and spoiling each other with water. Hao was dumbfounded by what he saw, and immediately inquired as to what they were doing here. In response, the sisters cheered and pounced on him, a story about cohabiting with beautiful twins 3 days ago. Jen greedily absorbed the knowledge of the light path sword ability. Hao literally began to imagine how he would exterminate evil things with this skill. But one of Lilin's twins said he couldn't use that ability. Frustrated Ren asked why it wasn't suitable for him. They replied that reaching the Kong level was the foundation, all the more so for a novice cultivator, as a result of which he or she is obliged to practice basic cultivation techniques. And besides, whatever he chooses should be a perfect fit for Hao. Lu wondered if he had heard of the physical characteristics. Jen replied that Miss Su had a water metal body type, but he didn't specifically understand the characteristics. The twins swept up that the spiritual concentration technique only expands his meridians and allows him to strengthen his body. So it doesn't matter what his characteristics are, but are necessary to reach Khan's level. Our hero didn't quite know what they were talking about and didn't know where to begin. The girls stated that they have investigated Hao, and his body is a chaotic mixture that consists of 5 elements. The Light Path Sword technique is the best of the 5-element cultivations designed specifically for cultivators who have a 5-element body type in the spirit world. Hao asked if it was good for him. She replied that this type of body consists of a complete set of elements, which is different from a chaotic combination of 5 elements. And the energy of this body, consisting of these 5 elements, is like 5 parallel pillars supporting the power of cultivation. Adding that the best 5-element cultivation techniques evenly reinforce each support, by noting that the energy of the chaotic mixture of these 5 elements is like jumbled colored sand. It cannot be separated. Cultivators usually select the sand that is most abundant among the rest and exclude the rest. Jen listened to the girls carefully and said that he now understood everything. Lilin swept that the water cultivation technique would be the best for him because it would be suitable for attacks as well as defense. Hao asked which 5-element technique was better. The twins replied that his improvement would become more gentle and pretty solid. All 5 elements will improve at the same rate, but it will reach the same level as the others. About 4 times as long, and even in the spirit world few people practice it, he thought. digesting the information he had received. Jen stated quite confidently that such an option was fine for him, saying that Sue and him have different physics and he could hurt her if he transferred his spiritual energy. But if Hao cultivates all 5 elements equally well, it won't happen. The girls glanced over, then replied that the light path sword technique would most likely be the best option for her. Jen stated that in that case, he would practice that particular technique. The twins bowed to him and said they would obey him. Hao asked them to eliminate these formalities, after which Jen hurriedly headed to his room to immediately start practicing. He realized that cultivating this technique would be extremely slow, but he didn't suspect it to be this slow. And if it continues like this, Hao won't make it through the Kang level in time for Yanzi's birthday. Ren began to fidget and beat the bed with his fists in anger. Suddenly his anger was interrupted by a knock on the door. Walking over to which opened it, being completely out of sorts, Hao again saw the twins on the doorstep. They said that they knew how to help him, because they had found the key to cultivating the light path sword technique. The joyful girls looked at Hao's sour face and hurriedly entered the room. Jen asked in a rather sad voice what they had found that could help. They started scattering things in his closet, saying they needed to get ready first. A few minutes later, the sisters, dressed as if they were teachers, said that class was starting. This got on Jenyu's nerves, and he irritably asked them why they were dressed up like that. The twins apologized to him and told him he could punish them. Hao urged them to start soon. They tried to concentrate on learning again and began to explain things to him. That the Sword of Light Path has 7 levels, from low to high: Tianshu, Tianshuang, Tianchuan, Tianyi, Tianquan, Yuheng, Kaiyang, and Yaoguang. And each of them has 9 steps. The main thing is to strengthen and unite the 5 elements at the same time. And the purest 5 elements will become lightning when mixed together. After which, the girls said that they were slightly mistaken, and the light track sword was actually a lightning cultivation. Hao was literally taken aback when he heard about the lightning cultivation. Lily said that everyone knows how cultivators are afraid of celestial, but no one understands why. Lightning is actually a mixture of 5 elements, but ordinary cultivators only have 1 or 2 elements to match them. And that's why they can't without misfortune. Hao began to realize that lightning cultivators are invincible. She replied that their strength is terrifying, but it is difficult for them to progress because they have to strengthen all 5 elements. And at the same time, so there are fewer of them. And to break through to the realm of Kang, Hao needs to reach the first step of Tianshuan. The girls moved closer to him, saying that it was necessary to check his body since the metal was at the 7th step of the Tianshu level. Wood on the 9th step of Tianshu, water on the 3rd step of Tianshuan, fire on the 8th step of Tianshu, earth on the 6th step of Tianshu. Jen practiced the water element technique, so the power of the 5 elements is unbalanced, and one must absorb the other 4 elements. The girls literally swarmed him, saying they would definitely help him. Then they pushed him onto the bed. Uncomprehending and blushing with embarrassment, Hao asked what they were going to do. The twins climbed onto his bed and replied that they wanted to help him. Jen firmly stated that he was able to help himself and could do without them. In turn, the girls took off his shirt, saying it was necessary. After that, they began to look and touch his body, as if they were looking for certain points. Hao was extremely tense, causing Lilin to ask him to relax, saying that they should undergo such a process every day as it is beneficial to his cultivation. Jen didn't know where to place himself at this moment, and naturally couldn't loosen up. At this time, the alarm clock rang for no reason. Hao didn't realize what was going on. Suddenly his body began to sparkle with different colored energies that seemed to envelop him. After a certain amount of time, Ren was covered in sweat and opened his eyes. He saw the worried twins in front of him looking at him worriedly. Lily then shouted happily that they had finally succeeded in evolving all of his elements to Dabe's 9th level. Hao said he felt some kind of change in himself, suggesting that he had gotten closer to a breakthrough. The girl noticed that his cultivation base was still not enough to break through to the Kang realm. Our hero smiled and replied that it didn't matter, because he had found a more interesting thing. A few days later, Yanzi's birthday finally arrived. In the Royal Palace of Dragons, arranged incredibly beautiful performances of artists. The celebration was truly awesome. Zhao Guang had really tried his best to surprise his daughter. He and his wife greeted the guests and thanked them for their presence at the birthday party. And they responded by saying that the party was a success. Hao also stood beside them. The guests remarked that he was a young and promising future son-in-law. But in reality, he had a hard time with these kinds of social situations. What Miss Hongyu noticed, she in turn approached Zhenyu. Yi said that he was tired of meeting the guests, so she asked him to go to Zi's house and check on the preparations. Naturally, our joyful hero agreed. Miss Hongyu smiled back at him. Ren took his gift and immediately headed towards Yanzi. He wondered if she was still mad at him. After all, it had been a while, and the last time Hao had seen her was at a family gathering. As he got closer, he noticed Z taking the gifts with a displeased look, saying that she didn't like it. Then turning around, she saw Zhen. For a few seconds, they looked at each other. He stood with his gift in his hands. Yanzi was dressed in a beautiful dress, and she had funny horns on her head. Embarrassed, she turned away from Hao and told him to stop looking at her like that. Jen, in turn, complimented her, saying that she was unusually beautiful today. Z blushingly replied that she dressed like that for her family, not for him. Hao exhaled and decided to give her his gift that he had almost forgotten to give her. He called out to her and shyly told her he had a present for her. Yanzi turned around. Jen hurriedly handed her a beautifully packaged box. She arrogantly said that she was rather hard to impress. Hao tensed up. Zai opened the box and saw a teddy bear. Jen said it wasn't really valuable. Hao said in a trembling voice that he hoped she would like such a gift, but Z replied that she was no longer a little girl, so she didn't like teddy bears. That said, however, she clung to him like he was her own, and said it was very sweet. Jen said he could return the teddy bear and buy her another gift. Yanzi replied sharply that Hao himself had given it to her, which meant it was her bear. Jen didn't understand how her mood changed so quickly, making her more unpredictable. Our hero said the twin situation made her angry last time. Jen said he didn't know why, but he still wanted to apologize to her. Yanzi asked him if that was why he gave her a teddy bear. Hao inarticulately said that technically he was still her fiancé, and that situation was out of his control, asking Z to forgive him. She replied that she didn't care at all who he became intimate with, adding at least Jen didn't forget that he was hers. She huffed at this point. Hao interjected to Z. She, still hiding her sympathy for him, got angry and said he was the stupidest man in the world. After which she grabbed his arm and dragged him behind her. Hao didn't understand what Yanzi was doing. She said they should hurry up because everyone was waiting for them. They walked down the red carpet, to Guan's throne where he sat with Miss Hongyu. All the men began to discuss Z's appearance, saying that the princess was very beautiful. In turn, the women found Hao handsome, wondering if he was human. Meanwhile, they caught the eye of Itao Zhang and his siblings. Jen also turned his attention to him, realizing that the fun was just beginning. The Dragon King of the Western Ocean also arrived, bringing with him a 1,000-year-old purple coral, 10 pieces of Western Ocean ice, and 10 high and warm jade stones. The dragons of the Western Ocean were generous. People have observed that 10 pieces of ice from the Western Ocean could feed 5 or 6 7th Realm Masters. The girls gossiped that it was a dub to achieve the Princess of the Eastern Ocean. Zhao Guang thanked Mr. Zheng for such generous gifts. The one in turn laughed and replied that it was okay and they should be family friends, adding that they would be inbreeding in the near future, looking at Yanzi. However, Guan did not reciprocate, but instead shifted his eyebrows and glared at him menacingly. Old Man Zheng called out to Z and walked closer to her, still cracking a smile. He started writing out compliments to her, telling her she was getting prettier and prettier each time. Afterward, asked her to become a daughter-in-law, respectively Itao's wife, what she clearly didn't want. Yanzi glanced at his sly physiognomy, then rather confidently declared that she would not become his daughter-in-law and Itao's wife. At this moment, Zhao Guang told Zheng Ping not to touch his daughter. Hao also did not hesitate, and stood between Yanzi and Old Man Ping, glaring menacingly at him. He took Tsu's hand and put it behind his back, letting her know he would protect her. At this time, everyone tensed up. Hao fearlessly looked the elder in the eyes. She was extremely surprised that Jen dared to take such a responsible step. Zhang Ping didn't understand such a maneuver from such a young lad. He was discouraged. Gaining confidence, our hero continued to sizzle him with his gaze. Meanwhile, Miss Hongyu decided to act. She called out to Zheng. She apologized to him and told him their daughter was already engaged. Old Man Ping didn't understand what was going on and looked at Guan's adamant wife. Afterward, inquired how she could be engaged to a man, especially since Yanzi is too good for this young guy. Itao, in turn, was literally dumbfounded by such news. Ping said that his grandson Itao Zheng had reached the 3rd realm a few days ago, adding that he was the youngest cultivator to reach this level, a metallic element. Itao stepped out of the crowd and bowed low, saying that he flattered him, and there was still work to be done. He began to tell me that the Dragon Clan of the Eastern Ocean definitely needed an heir, and it would be wrong to leave the Eastern Ocean to man. Hao, meanwhile, began to boil with anger, and was already clenching his fists. Itao slowly walked up to Yanzi and smilingly looked into her eyes, after which took the teddy bear in her hands that Jen had given her, and with a haughty face inquired if the trash he had presented was his. Yanzi got angry in a moment, and saying that it was none of his business, demanded that the bear be returned to her. Zheng Itao deliberately tossed aside the toy, playing on Princess Z's nerves. He took Yanzi's hand and put the bracelet on her, telling her that magic toys were much better. He then began to hug her, saying that such gifts were more appropriate. Our hero reacted immediately. He stepped closer to Itao and abruptly grabbed his arm, demanding him to let go of Z immediately. After a few seconds, he repeated his demand, saying that Itao had better obey him. For a while, Jen and Zheng stared menacingly into each other's eyes, after which Hao once again repeated to him, still holding his hand the same way. Itao pushed him away, thus wrenching his hand from his grasp. Yanki remarked that even mountains of gold wouldn't replace that teddy bear for her. Zheng literally flew into a rage, and instantly blazed with magical fire. Hao stood between him and Princess Z, wondering what Itao wanted. The one in turn laughed and said that Jen had decided to play hero for nothing. After a couple of seconds, Zeng gave him a chance, fighting him in battle. And if he wins, Itao will spontaneously refuse to marry Yanzi. Hao naturally agreed. At this time, Z tried to dissuade our hero by saying that he might die because Itao has the 3rd level. Jen replied that he would protect her and the Eastern Ocean, trying his best to reassure her. Itao said that he would lower his cultivation level since it would still be enough to deal with him. Yanzi angrily said that Hao hadn't even reached the 1st level. Zhang smiled and replied that it was all he could do to help in this situation. Adding that Hao was too weak, Ren in turn hurried him to demonstrate his strength. Itao was fixing his hair and smiling at him. Hao realized that the fight wouldn't be easy. After a while, they found themselves in the arena around which everyone had gathered to watch the battle. Jen prepared to strike a fighting pose and stared embitteredly into Itao's eyes, after which shimmered with magic and lightning swept towards him. Zeng was surprised, noting that he dared to attack first, for which he will be punished. Itao began to use his abilities, sending magic swords into battle, which subsequently wounded Hao. He let out more of them each time, saying that Ren wasn't so brave anymore, and could only run around in circles. Hao tried to dodge his magic, realizing that even with a reduced cultivation level, his combat experience was still much more than Jen's. At a certain point, the ground beneath Hao's feet began to crack. Itao didn't stop pelting him with magic skills. Our hero tried to counter it, realizing that he's a pretty strong opponent and contemplating the next course of action. Zeng at this time decided to attack him. Noticing that Ren couldn't move, running closer to him, Itao once again used his magic. Thus he literally pinned him against the column. Hao began to realize that his water energy was failing as Zeng formed spiritual metal energy into swords. They were waiting for the right moment, for a surprise attack by the opponent. Jen wasn't going to give up, even though he knew he was weaker than Zeng. Hao, lightning fast released his magic ability into him. However, Itao activated the shield, saying that his cultivation couldn't compete with his. After which, Zeng began to counterattack Hao while holding his shield. He released the metal sword again, only at a closer range. And this time, Zhen didn't have time to react. The sword came across his cheek, thus injuring him. Hao clearly did not expect such speed. A smiling Itao urged him to defend himself better and get to the action. Hao Ren immediately began to use all of his skills. He realized that it was necessary to try every possible option. But Zeng put up his shield again, saying that he wouldn't succeed since he was human. Hao unleashed a thunder sword at him, which successfully hit the target, thus shattering Itao's shield and piercing through his shoulder. As a result, Zeng collapsed to the ground with a thunderous crash and began to gush blood. He said that spiritual water energy couldn't be that strong. Hao replied that it was thunder sword energy, not water energy. Itao furiously uttered that Hao was talking utter nonsense and it couldn't be true. The protagonist replied that the combination of the purest 5 elements is lightning, after which, generating a lightning sparking arrow, he threw it at Itao. Jen then hurriedly dispelled it. He believed that Zeng would lose the battle. Itao in turn fell to his knees and began to cough up blood. Lifting his head, he looked at Hao and said that he was stronger than he had realized. Itao got to his feet, generating a fire sword, saying that he was about to show him his true power. At this moment, he raised his hands. A fiery sphere formed above him, and a kind of whistling sound was created. After that, the flame turned into a large phoenix that spread its wings. Itao stated that this time he would straighten out his lightning energy. Zeng was full of confidence and looked menacingly into Zhenyu's eyes. The one in turn realized that this bird, a polymer of metal spiritual energy. Hao gritted his teeth, still generating his lightning bolts the same way, and waited for the right moment. Itao, at that second, pointed the firebird towards our hero. Hao instantly tried to attack, piercing the phoenix with his lightning, which by and large he succeeded. He literally cut the bird in half. Unknown golden discs flew out from the firebird, heading in different directions, and all that was left of the phoenix suddenly flew at its master. What Itao Zeng did not expect in any way, having only managed to pay attention. However, he caught some of the fire lightning, after which he smiled at Hao, saying there's nothing he can do to stop an attack like this. After which he immediately released lightning bolts towards Jen, which in turn stabbed into the body of the protagonist, causing significant damage. Hao flew back. He hadn't expected this turn of events, but he couldn't resist. The bloody Jen realized that other than the lightning-fast cultivation technique, nothing could harm Itao, and he dealt with all of his attacks quite easily. Hao slowly getting to his feet. He began to reminisce, pondering the balance and conversion. Wanting to use the power of the 5 elements, Itao naively thought he could handle it. Jen seemed to lighten up, and he said that Zeng was rejoicing early because the fight wasn't over yet. The son of the Western Dragon King tensed up, realizing that this guy wasn't as simple as he seemed. Hao, in turn, hurriedly used his abilities. A magical wreath of wood appeared above Itao's head. Zeng stated that metal destroys wood, therefore he would not be able to harm it. After which Itao literally flamed up, saying that he preferred to use it. The next moment, however, he was surprised, and didn't realize what was happening, because the wooden wreath just caught fire and started to tighten up, binding his hands, thus restraining the son of the Western Dragon King in his movements. Jen continued to successfully knit his legs together with the flaming firewood. After a few seconds, he was completely bound, including his head, as a result of which he was covered in flames and began to scream in unbearable pain. Hao stated that different kinds of spiritual energy can transform into each other. The protagonist anticipated his victory and watched Itao's body burn. Who no longer seemed so formidable at this time, Ren began to be overcome by a cough. Spitting out blood onto his palm, he realized he had used up too much energy, and he wanted to finish what he had started as soon as possible, as he could be at a disadvantage again. Hao started throwing magic arrows at Zheng, thus nailing him to the ground, after which he immediately headed in his direction to finish the battle. He grabbed the immobilized Itao, continuing to use his abilities. Hao's hand lit up with blue flames in front of Zheng's face, who realized he was in a losing position. In the aftermath of which there was a big explosion, everyone was shocked at what was happening. Blue flames literally enveloped them in the center of the arena. Jen hoped this was the end. However, the son of the Western Dragon King could not be defeated so easily. The resulting fog of dust dissipated, and Itao appeared in a slightly different image before Hao. He had claws on his hands and feet, as well as horns on his head, and was partially covered in golden scales. It was as if Zheng was gradually transforming into a dragon, his body getting stronger, something that Jen didn't expect. He gave the protagonist a crushing blow, saying that he has some pretty nifty tricks. But in front of the dragon's real power, it's all meaningless, Itao continued beating Hao. Suddenly his huge dragon tail grew. Jen was lying on the ground, after which he hurriedly stood up, paying attention to Zheng's transformation. Itao instantly headed towards the injured Hao, who didn't have time to react. The angered Zheng in turn sensed the advantage and grabbed him by the neck, saying that his dragon skin is as hard as armor that he can't penetrate. Adding that their claws were as sharp as swords, Itao reached his hand out to Zhenyu, after which smilingly began stabbing him with his claws. Hao could do nothing but gush blood and endure the savage pain. Zheng continued to say that neither are strong by nature. He wrapped his tail around Jen and squeezed hard, thus breaking his ribs. Hao found it extremely difficult to breathe. Itao then tossed him aside to the side of the pillar, saying that humans could never stand up to the likes of him. Z became nervous when she saw Zheng start to dominate Zheng, beating him up. Itao demanded, leaving his dragon palace immediately. He turned away and headed out. However, Hao said that he still hadn't won, while simultaneously releasing his lightning arrows at him. Adding that he never gave up, Itao in turn dodged Jen's attacks with ease. He stated that in that case Hao would die in front of everyone. Zheng headed towards him again, after which he inhaled sharply with a full chest, his hands glistening with magic. Suddenly, Itao let out a wild dragon roar, causing all the lightning bolts to literally crumble. They dust fell to the ground one by one, never reaching their target. Zheng prevented Zheng from getting close to him in every way possible. However, Hao still tried to inflict damage on him, unleashing another batch of lightning arrows. Saying it wasn't the end, he heroically confronted the mighty Itao. The son of the Western Dragon King, in turn, was confidently heading towards him. Lightning bolts fell at his feet without harming him in any way. Zheng naively thought that Hao couldn't do anything to him. He laughed at his attempts, but a second later he stepped on one of the lightning bolts, which sparked. Itao didn't realize what was happening. He couldn't keep moving towards Zhenyu. Finding a kind of electric circle on the ground formed by the lightning arrows, Hao smiled looking into his eyes, saying that he only needed to trap him. The ground beneath Zheng's feet lit up with blue flames, a definite star-shaped sign looming. Itao ended up inside a kind of ball that he couldn't break through. He stated that Hao had deliberately confused him to finish forming the sword. Jen replied that he naturally had to apply a few tricks. After all, he had spent a lot of time for Linlin and Lily to train him in such an ability. Itao wondered what he meant. Z exhaled a sigh of relief at this moment, saying that Hao had scared her a lot. After all, she thought that he would lose the battle to Zheng, but things had changed drastically. The protagonist stated that he had promised to protect her, and so he would do his best to do so. Meanwhile, Zheng Ping swept up that by trapping Itao, he had not won, but merely achieved a draw. Zhao said that the guy had challenged someone who was superior to him, and by immobilizing him, he had already impressed them. At this point, Ren declared that this was just an appetizer and he would now proceed to the main course. Itao wondered what else he could do since he had exhausted his spiritual energy. Hao smiled and replied that he would see for himself. He couldn't wait to use this ability. Jen immediately began activating his super skill. Everyone watched what was happening. Mr. Zhao paid attention to his spiritual energy. He was surprised. Our hero, in turn, continued to generate blue flames around him. Zheng anxiously asked where he got his spiritual energy from. After all, it was going to run out. Suddenly, Hao constructed a magical blue sword and swung it towards Itao, saying that it was a third realm strike. Zheng was puzzled, realizing that nothing good awaited him. He just watched. Jen declared that the one was about to experience the true power. Zheng couldn't believe that it was really a third realm strike. Hao immediately unleashed a crushing blow on him. Lightning flashed around him. Zheng Ping became nervous at this moment, shouting out his inconsiderate son's name. It all happened very quickly. The purple magic dragon literally swallowed Itao. In doing so, it also caught Hao, who subsequently flew off to the side. Pin immediately headed to his heir's aid. Running up to Itao, who was unconscious, he began urging him to wake up. Zhao said that he should not interfere in the battle between the two young beings. An exasperated Ping Zheng said that they had lost after all, taking his offspring under his arms. Kuo reminded him of his unfulfilled promise, hinting that this was not the end. Zheng Ping gritted his teeth and said that he was taking back his words about marriage, then hurriedly left with Itao. The exhausted protagonist exhaled a sigh of relief, realizing that it was finally over. He noticed the anxious Yanzi heading towards him. She literally threw her arms around him. Hao hadn't expected such behavior from her. He looked at her worried face in surprise. Z looked at him the same way. After which, she began to beat him softly with her small fists, asking why he had put himself in danger. Hao, smiling and teasing her, said that he was actually in pain. Yanzi noticed his numerous injuries. She felt genuinely sorry for him, because he was really in a deplorable condition and was all battered up. Hao could barely stay on his feet. Z tried to hold him up, examining his injuries that the son of the Western Dragon King had inflicted. She knew he needed help. At this moment, Ren lost consciousness, leaning completely on Yanzi. She, in turn, asked someone to bring her medicine. Mrs. Hongyu noticed that Hao had done a pretty good job and gave him the medicine. Zhao Guang said that he did not expect him to use the Third Realm Strike. Kuo assumed that he had to use some sort of secret spell to exchange life force for spiritual energy. Yanzi wondered what they could do in this situation, asking her uncle to save Jen. The restless Lei Rui was watching from the side. He was also extremely surprised that Hao was able to deal with Itao Zhang. Everyone crowded around Jen, saying that he had better not make any sudden movements. At this moment, sisters Linlin and Lily ran up. He declared that his wounds were too serious and only they could help him. Z asked them to save Hao, who in turn began to lose consciousness again. The sisters moved closer to him, wondering how he was feeling. Jen lay half-fainted, his mind was clouded and his thoughts were confused. Linlin said that he used a spell that was above his level and could even die. Lily noticed that his spiritual energy was out of control and he could shatter all of his meridians. And if they had come a little later, the consequences could have been irreversible. Tzu asked why such a thing happened. Jen tried to get up, but he had no strength. He replied that it was all just a little trick. Linlin muttered that it was extremely risky and dangerous to his life. Yanzi wondered if the fairy was telling the truth. Hao decided to remain silent. Uncle Kuo assumed that he had used a type of forbidden spell. Ren replied that he was able to win, thanks to the secret of the Light Path Sword technique that he had realized, adding that this technique allows you to transmute elements, and the transmutation itself can be used to attack. Zai asked how he was able to release so much elemental energy at one time, since all the elements are mixed in their primal state. At this time, Uncle Kuo suddenly walked over to him. He looked at Hao. As if he wanted to tell him something important, Jen was in anticipation. After which Kuo laughed, saying that this young man turned out to be quite perceptive. Only Yanzi couldn't understand anything. Hao turned to her and answered her question, saying that Mr. Kuo is a strong cultivator and elemental energy is contained in his body in its purest form, so he borrowed from him. Uncle in turn said it was no big deal because he was still able to chase Itao away, adding that he should be thanked by everyone on the contrary. At this moment, Hao called out to Rui, who stepped closer to him and suddenly kneeled down in front of him. Ren didn't realize what was going on. Crouching down, Lei apologized to him. He said he thought he was a mere mortal and not worthy of Miss Z, and even wanted to prevent their wedding, giving an incomplete version of the spiritual concentration scroll. Hao replied that he already had trouble understanding cultivation techniques. At this moment, the embittered Uncle Kuo literally lost his temper and headed towards Jui. He grabbed him and told him that he was a vile and despicable crook whom he would kill with his own hands. Kuo was about to beat up Lei already, but at that time, Hao decided to intervene. He grabbed Uncle Kuo's hand, intending to stop him and urging him to calm down. He then struck Juyu himself, who in turn fell to the ground. Everyone was shocked at what was happening as they observed this situation. Yanzi was just as worried, standing beside Fairy Linlin and Lily. Jen slowly approached Lei. Everyone realized that he got what he deserved. Hao gave him his hand, saying that they were now even, to which Rui was surprised. He helped him stand up, adding that the past should always remain in the past. Our hero asked Uncle Kuo to keep him alive. Since Lei was doing this for Z and the Eastern Ocean, Ren didn't hold a grudge against him. Kuo agreed with him. Jue got down on one knee and thanked him for sparing him, promising to serve him forever. Hao had to take a few days off to recover from the fight at Yanzi's birthday party. Linlin said he had to eat well to recover quickly. The fairy sisters decided to bring him some fruit. They tried their best to please him. Jen in turn refused, saying he wasn't hungry right now. The next day, after recovering, Hao hurriedly went to school, where he went into the classroom and lay down on a desk, waiting for everyone to gather and the lesson to begin. Suddenly, Zi Yujia ran up to him. She asked how he was feeling. Ren replied that he was fine. She smiled and said that it was very good because her brother had issued some kind of order, where Hao was cleared to participate in a basketball game against Jihua University next month, which Jen was not very happy about. Z wished him good luck in the match, saying that Jihua are their school's longtime rivals. Our hero said that he is not worried about the match, because he has a wonderful coach in her person. Yujia in turn became embarrassed and smilingly looked at him, saying that the confidence in his voice reminded her of someone. Hao asked her in surprise who exactly he reminded her of. Z replied that she knew a cute boy when she was a child. Blushing, Yujia turned away. Jen didn't understand who they were talking about. He asked if they were close to him. Z shyly replied that she enjoyed watching him. Plus, he was always extremely polite to her. Yujia walked thoughtfully to the window, saying that she was a small and silly girl at that time. That boy in turn never complained about it, nor did he give it any importance. After a short pause, Hao still inquired if she had feelings for him. Z lowered her head and mouthed that she had some feelings, but they had long since lost touch with him. Also thanks to his influence, she is now studying and training hard. Jen sadly realized that she actually already had feelings for someone. After all the classes were over, the long-awaited bell finally rang. The sun was going behind the horizon. Hao leisurely headed towards his home. He was in no mood. Walking up to his apartment door, he hesitated. Then knocked, where he was greeted joyfully by his sisters, who began throwing themselves into his arms. Jen didn't understand why they were acting like this. Suddenly, the fairies said his parents were back. Hao was literally shocked, realizing that today was clearly not his day. Seconds later, his mom and dad were standing on the doorstep saying they were back after all. Jen, in turn, for well-known reasons, had no great love for them. He looked sad and said he was going to his room. His parents looked after him. The mother understood everything perfectly well. Her tears began to flow. At this point, his father tried to stop him, asking him to stay with them, as they hadn't seen each other for a long time. He put his arm around him, but Jenyu didn't like it and stepped aside. Hao asked how many days they had come for this time, and what they planned to do. His mother sat down with him, saying that they wanted to stay a long time, and they planned to spend more time with him and his grandmother. Father remarked that it was thanks to Mr. Z who helped them with the move. Hao hesitated for a moment before asking which Mr. Z was referring to. Mom replied that he often visited him as a child. They also have a daughter his age who followed Jen all the time. Dad laughed, saying that they were then jokingly talking about their future wedding. Hao Ren replied that he remembered that girl named Radish. The next day at school, the fairies picked on Hao. Lily offered to give him a shoulder massage. Linlin wanted a foot massage. Jen didn't understand what they were doing here, which he immediately asked them about. Lily replied that they are now the granddaughters of Mr. Lu Qin. Linlin added that because of this, they must attend classes as well. The students started whispering about Hao getting two beautiful girls to serve him in class. Another said that the two girls are Mr. Lu's granddaughters. Someone pointed out that Jen already had Yujia, who in turn was just as beautiful in appearance. At this moment, Z walked into the auditorium. She leisurely walked towards Hao. Seeing the given picture, Yujia suddenly stopped. She became jealous. All the students realized that something not very good was about to happen. Some of them even hurriedly left the classroom. Z watched in exasperation as the girls groomed Jen. Stepping closer to them, she nervously slapped the table, the sisters paying attention to her. Z stated that if they are not students or teachers, they are required to leave the classroom. Linlin hurriedly presented her student ID card, saying that they were also studying here. Yujia scrutinized their tickets and said that they were studying in a different department. Linlin asked if there was a rule prohibiting them from being in another faculty's classroom. Z replied that there was no such rule. But they are disrupting the classroom and interfering with other students. Linlin assumed they were probably interfering with her, which in turn infuriated Yujia. She demanded for this buffoonery to stop, saying they can't do whatever they want, even if they are Mr. Lu's granddaughters. Linlin inquired as to why she was so angry with them. Z assumed, sadly saying that she also had feelings for Hao. At this time, Ren couldn't stand it and loudly shouted the fairy sister's name, thus trying to end communication in such a manner. The girls looked at him sadly. Hao persuaded Lily and Linlin to leave the office and return to his classroom, which they eventually hastened to do. Moments later, they exited the auditorium. Yujia was distraught. Ren tried to calm her down somehow, but Z said it was class time and they'd talk afterward. Hao was counting the minutes until all the lessons were over so he could explain everything to Yujia. He knew he had to apologize to her for the circus. After that, it was necessary to explain her relationship with the twins. At the moment of his pondering, a sad Z walked over. She called out to Jen. For a while, they looked at each other, not knowing how to start a conversation. The protagonist looked at her. Yujia in turn lowered her eyes. After an awkward pause, they spoke at the same time, to which they were only surprised. Jen, like a true gentleman, suggested that she speak first. Unexpectedly, Z stated that they needed to keep their distance. Hao tried to explain to her that it was his fault, and he should have stopped the sisters in time. He apologized. But Yujia said that's not the point. Lately, there have been rumors amongst classmates that they are dating. Jen denied this information, saying that they are only friends. Z replied that she didn't care about the gossip, but it wasn't fair to him. Adding as she talked about her brother, she suddenly realized that she would hate it if he was intimate with other girls. With her not wanting to let him down anymore, Jen sadly asked her if she was doing this for him. Yuji turned away and said that it was true. She started to remember her childhood, where she used to walk with that boy. Z turned to Jen-Yu and said with a smile that she would forever be his radish. Hao realized everything at this moment. She was actually that girl, who he used to walk with when he was a kid. Jen vaguely began to remember his childhood. He had no idea it would turn out like this and she'd be the radish. A few days later came the very moment when the basketball game was to be played. Hao has been actively practicing on the court, practicing his shots at the basket. As well as the passes under the ring, he was a little nervous before the big event. People slowly began to fill the bleachers in anticipation of the fight. Jen's entire family, along with his grandmother, were present, shouting words of encouragement to him. Hao looked around at all the fans and noticed that Yuji hadn't arrived yet. Jen was a little upset that she wasn't there. He turned his attention to his opponents, after which he thought again about the beautiful Z, with whom they had not been getting along very well lately. Jen still couldn't believe that she actually turned out to be a radish, and he was accordingly her brother, of whom she spoke warmly. The protagonist suddenly remembered her words about how she made a promise, that when she grows up, she'll be his wife. Hao understood perfectly well. He couldn't tell her the truth about what the one she was talking about really was. It is him, because then she would think that Jen had decided to take advantage of her. The only thing they can do is keep their distance from each other. Hao couldn't help but think about Yuji, who at the moment never showed up for the match. He tried to abstract himself from these thoughts as he continued to train hard. At this time, he was handed an absorbent cloth to wipe away the sweat. Raising his head, he found Linlin in front of him. Jen wondered what she was doing here. She replied that she and Lily had come to support him and watch him play basketball. The sisters then apologized to him, saying that they were guilty before him, and promised not to do it again. Hao pointed out that it was his fault too, for he hadn't trained them properly, adding that they will put this situation in the past, but it shouldn't happen again. Linlin threw herself into his arms, saying that she thought he wouldn't forgive them and wouldn't want to see them again. At this moment, Yanzi approached them, calling Hao an incorrigible womanizer. Jen realized he was in an awkward position, and again because of those twins. Our hero wondered in surprise what Zhao Zi was doing here. She replied that she was invited by Mrs. Su, asking him a counter question, is it impossible for her to attend? Han's teacher said she wanted to watch him in his first basketball game. Yanzi swept up that she had only come for him, and if he dared to lose. Though he knows what the consequences will be, she began to unclench her fists and smile at him. Z looked around and didn't find Yuji anywhere. She was surprised. Afterwards, she asked Hao why C didn't come to the match today. Jen became sad in a moment. He didn't know what to say to her, because he himself was tormented by this question. Meanwhile, Yuji ran into the court in her uniform, which Jen was genuinely happy about. She ran up to them and apologized for being late. An awkward moment was created between Hao and C. They looked at each other silently. Yuji lowered her eyes without saying anything. Jen was also unable to squeeze out a single word. For a while, they just stood in silence, Hao looking at the offended Z. Yanzi, in turn, confused by the speculation, did not understand what was going on. Jen's parents noticed the pandemonium of girls near their son. Hao's father remarked that he had already met a girl in uniform somewhere recently. Mom said it was the same girl who was at the lecture with Jen. He replied that he had seen her before this lecture, starting to dig into his memory. After that, it was as if he had a flash of light, and he finally remembered this girl. Hao's father said he realized who she was. Grandmother looked at him in surprise. He immediately rushed toward the basketball court. Running in, he hurried over to them. Yue and his grandmother didn't understand why he had come up to them. Mr. Hao asked if her name was Z Yujia, she replied positively, then asked how he knew her name and what brought him here. Hao's father said that when she was a child, they lived in the neighborhood. Yujia was shocked to realize that he was the father of that very brother. At this moment, Yanzi approached them. She inquired how he knew Z. He replied that he used to work with Z's father, and Ren used to go out with Yujia a lot when he was young, and at one time even discussed their engagement, saying it was a long time ago. Zai was shocked and didn't know how to react when she heard this information. Z was just as shocked and couldn't find the words. She looked at Jen. Hao in turn remained silent, realizing the state Yujia was in right now. Z began to remember all the things she had said to Jen-Yu, not knowing that he was her brother when she was a child. She was ashamed that she said such things to Hao. He tried to calm her down. Saying that he'd only recently found out himself, he stepped closer to her. Yujia asked him to forget everything she had said to him that day. Hao's father remarked that Jen had such a beautiful girl at such a young age, hinting at his good taste. Aziz suddenly cried. The main character hugged her, trying to comfort her somehow. She started reminiscing about her childhood spent with him. Yujia said she wanted to spend her whole life with him. Jen replied that in that case, she would have to be his bride. She willingly agreed to be his wife when she grew up. She wondered if Hao remembered all those moments from their childhood. At this moment, Yanzi sarcastically said that Ren must be very happy with a bride like Yujia. He smiled and replied that they were just stupid things he had said when they were kids. Zi was greatly annoyed by the fact that they had known each other since they were children. Yujia realized perfectly well that Yanzi actually liked Hao. Meanwhile, they announced the start of the basketball game, urging all players to get ready. Zhen realized that now was not the time to figure things out. He headed to the playground. A joyful Yujia wished him good luck. Saying that she and Yanzi would cheer for him, Zai in turn looked depressed. A few minutes later, the long-awaited match began. The scoreboard showed the score, 12-2 points in favor of Jinghua. Eastern Ocean University had an extremely poor start to the game. Huang Shujie was driving the ball. Suddenly, a Jinghua University player got in his way. Huan, in turn, was able to push him back and move forward with the ball. They played an extremely tough game. The Jinghua basketball team has always been known for its impeccable defense. At the same time, very carefully executed their every move containing the attackers. Hao instantly overtook one of the defenders, gaining a good position. He called out to Shuji to give him the ball since he was in a better position. However, Huan ignored him, attempting to pass the player himself. As a result, he failed to do so because the defender took the ball away from him. Shuji was literally furious, not realizing how he had been robbed. Hao had many good opportunities to put the ball in, but no one ever gave him a pass. That in turn bored the coach, who decided to take a timeout. Zhen realized that they were only at the beginning of the period and couldn't be allowed to get any more points. Needing to come up with a solution to this problem, Shujie was furious and spewed out his emotions. Juan said he was a professional and couldn't allow this kind of thing to happen. At that moment, he was grabbed by his shirt by Hao, stating that he was not here for public attention. Adding that they badly needed this victory over Jinghua University, Shujie replied that he also wants to win the match and is working for the good of the whole team. What Zhen disagreed with was that they were behind in the score and needed to work cohesively as a team. At this time, hitting them on the head, the coach urged them to calm down and forget about the disagreement. They became quiet in a moment and listened attentively to his admonitions. He then hugged them, saying that they were both talented players that he had personally selected for the team. Saying that they shouldn't let him down meanwhile, Yujia announced the end of the timeout. Saying that Hao would definitely succeed, Yanzi also supported him. Zhen gave a thumbs up, signaling that he had heard their words of encouragement. Teacher Han surprisingly told Z that she had a slightly different attitude before. Without letting her finish, Yanzi replied that it wasn't what she thought it was. Because she just doesn't want Hao to lose, because that way he'll embarrass Eastern Ocean University, whose reputation is closely tied to her father, and if he loses, it'll put not only her father in trouble, but her as well. Teacher Su said that in such a case, one must believe in Zhen, and he would not let them down. Meanwhile, the match continued, with the teams rushing onto the court. Shuijie successfully drove the ball and found himself in front of two Jinghua players. Hao in turn ran in behind the defenders, thus diverting some of the players to himself. Then he did a cheat, showing that he was going to throw the ball into the ring. As the players tried to block him, Huang passed the ball to Hao, telling him that he was obligated to go to the basket. Zhen concentrated as much as possible and jumped high above the Jinghua defenders. Then absolutely calmly threw the ball into the ring. Everyone was shocked. The Jinghua players were just as bewildered, realizing that they had been beaten like boys. Hao was walking to meet Xiuji, and after thanking him for the pass, decided to shake his hand. But the arrogant Huan ignored him and just walked on by, saying he's only working with him for the team to win, urging him not to get excited ahead of time. Zhen in turn was well aware that they had to win. Starting to play like a proper team, they gradually reduced the score. Zhen and Xiuji threw balls into the ring one after another. Jinghua's players couldn't resist them. Hao passed several players and then passed to Huang, who returned the ball to him under the ring. As a result, he put another ball in the basket, at which point the referee blew his whistle, signaling halftime. With a score of 36-31, Eastern Ocean University led the way. Zhen sipped some water, realizing that they still had half a match ahead of them, due to which it was impossible to relax. At this time, the girls' cheerleading squad ran out, calling on the University of the Eastern Ocean to continue its victorious march. Hao turned his attention to them and saw that it was the sisters with Z and Yujia. They said it was a special surprise for him. Zhen clearly didn't expect this from them. Yanzi and Z walked over to a tired-looking Hao. Z said that she didn't feel comfortable dressing like that, but the girls made her, adding that he had no right to lose now. Miss Su, who was sitting on the podium, understood that he would have to work hard to win. Moments later, the match referee signaled the start of the third period. So the second half began, with Han taking the lead and driving the ball. He then passed to Hao, who in turn successfully made his way to the ring. Zhen then coolly put the ball in the basket, but it wasn't enough as Jinghua University still took the lead. On the scoreboard, the score was 40-38 points in favor of Jinghua. Hao drove the ball forward. He was surrounded by the opposing team's defenders. Zhen immediately passed to Shuijie. Huan in turn did not hesitate at such a crucial moment and ran right up to the ring, absolutely calmly put the ball in the basket. The stands were literally going crazy. Eastern Ocean University finally tied the game early in the fourth period after trailing for the first 3 quarters. Linlin said the cheerleader worked. Yanzi replied, they only equaled the score, adding that they are bound to win. At this time, a Tsinghua University player drove the ball, then jumped high. The Eastern Ocean University defenders tried to put up a barrier against him. They didn't succeed, however, because he still put the ball in the ring. The score was 56-54 in favor of Tsinghua University. A player from the opposite team swept that they would win. Hao realized it was too early to relax. For a while, the teams exchanged successful offensive possessions, putting the ball in the basket. There was less and less time left, and the score was about even on points. Jen did another pass out with Xiuji, then put the ball in the ring. After that, Han also put the ball in the basket for a 1-point lead. There were literally 40 seconds left to the end of the match. The numbers on the scoreboard were burning, 66-67, not in favor of Tsinghua. One of the leaders of the rivalry has suggested that they are really worthy opponents, but Tsinghua will win. To which Hao strongly disagreed, replying that the Eastern Ocean would win. A Tsinghua University player drove the ball. His teammates asked for a pass, but he decided to pass Jen himself and throw the ball to the basket, which he eventually succeeded in doing, thus putting his team a point ahead. Hao, in turn, was unable to block him, which was extremely frustrating. The Tsinghua player looked at him with a smile and said that they would win. Jen was well aware that there were only 20 seconds left, and this was their last chance. Hao and Xiuji were extremely serious about winning and were unwilling to lose. Han passed the ball among the Tsinghua players, then gave a pass to Jen, saying that he was obliged not to let the ball go in the final seconds. Hao in turn became nervous, realizing the responsibility of the important moment. He received the ball and went to beat the Tsinghua University defenders. However, there were too many of them because they realized that you can't give him opportunities in the final seconds of the match. Jen still managed to find a loophole and skipped past a couple of Tsinghua players. With a glimpse at the scoreboard, he realized there was almost no time left, which meant it was necessary to act quickly with 2 more opposing players in front of him. Ren saw that Xiuji was blocked and there was no way to give him a pass. Huan urged him to act on his own, as it was his only chance of victory. The stands froze in anticipation of the end of the match, Yanzi yelling for him to put the ball in the basket. Yujia similarly joined in Jen's support, shouting out words of encouragement to him. Hao gathered his thoughts, concentrating fully on the throw, after which he soared into the heights. Everyone watched with open mouths. The opposing defenders put their hands out trying to block him. Jen exhaled and threw the ball towards the ring. It was as if time had slowed down. The entire Hao family, along with the support group, in the form of the girls and teacher Han, were worried. Meanwhile, the ball flew a few meters and still hit the basket, at which point the final buzzer sounded. The match ended with the Eastern Ocean University winning. With a score of 70-68, the team rushed to hug Hao. Yanzi, Yujia, and the sisters started jumping with happiness like this, saying that it was their merit. The stands erupted in cheers, and Jen began to throw himself up, thus congratulating him on his victory. Hao was also genuinely happy for such a successful ending to the match. Tsinghua, on the contrary, was resentful. Coach Ziwanjun at this time was rather reserved. He pulled out his phone and sent a text message inviting him to Jen's house, giving his home address. Hao was walking down the street in the evening and couldn't believe that Coach Jun had invited him to his house for dinner. After finding the desired address, Ren hurriedly entered the entryway and headed to the Z family's front door, after which he knocked a little anxiously, calling out to Mr. Vanya. The door opened abruptly. Hao managed to take a step back and saw her in front of him. Yujia was pleasantly surprised, his unexpected visit to her home. Jen stood just as perplexed and looked at her. She wondered what had brought him. Looking into his eyes, C literally blushed, creating quite an awkward moment. The silence was interrupted by Coach Jun, who said that Hao was their guest for the day. Z asked Wan why he didn't warn her. She would have at least bought something. Ren kindly replied that he wasn't hungry. Jun put on his apron and said that they won today's match against Tsinghua University, adding that it's all thanks to Hao, whom he will make his own dinner. Mr. Wan asked them to go to Yujia's room for now and rest while the food was being prepared. Z didn't expect such an action from her brother. Seconds later, the two of them were alone. Behind the closed door to her room, they began to glance at each other in silence. There was an awkward silence. Yujia blushed in a moment. Jen was similarly embarrassed. Hao looked around, realizing that Yujia's bedroom looked pretty good. It was in soft pink colors. C noticed that she had accidentally left her underwear on the bed. Yujia abruptly grabbed her clothes off the bed. Jen pretended not to see anything. Z politely asked him to take a seat while she got him some water. After apologizing to him for the mess in her room, she hurried away. Hao took a seat at her desk and turned his attention to an unknown book. He became extremely curious to see its contents, which he ended up doing. Opening the book on the first page, he saw their photos together with Yujia. Jen wondered if it was her and her pictured in the photo cards. Z walked over and put a glass of water on the table, then replied that she did, adding that when they were children, he had ground shells into powder and made crayons for her. After waiting a short pause, she asked him if he remembered that time. Hao realized that if he answered in the negative, she would be upset. He began to slur his words. Yujia understood everything and said that it wasn't surprising because it had been many years. Jen apologized to her. She replied that there was no need to apologize. After all, it wasn't his fault. Hao said he only remembered a little girl, nicknamed Radish, who followed him wherever he went. He barely remembers the rest, saying they turn out to have so many good memories. Yujia looked away embarrassed and smilingly said that he hadn't changed a bit since then, adding that he was still as honest and kind as before. Jen thought for a moment, then said she was looking at him through rose-colored glasses since he was her brother. Yujia sharply replied that it wasn't like that at all, then calmly said, even if he wasn't her brother, she'd still feel that way. At this moment, their dialogue was interrupted by Jun's voice from behind the door, saying that dinner was ready. She turned away and headed for the exit, saying it was time for them to sit down at the table. Zhenya wondered what she wanted to tell him, implying something important. After a while, they emptied the contents of the table after they had had enough to eat. Hao remarked that Coach Jun was a wonderful cook, something he had never imagined. Mr. Wan replied that he should learn to cook too if he wanted to be with Yujia. Z in turn began to resist, saying he was talking about the wrong thing. Jun pronounced that he knew about her brother Hao, who she had been in love with all these years. She told Jun not to listen to this nonsense, then dragged him along for a walk in the park. Yujia suddenly stopped and shyly thanked Hao. He also slowed down and turned to her, wondering what she was thanking him for. Z stepped closer to him and looked up into the mysterious starry sky. She said she'd been waiting all these long years for her favorite brother, and dreaming of their next meeting. At that moment, something unknown flew through the sky. Yujia uttered. She had no idea that Hao would turn out to be her brother. But she's very happy now. Z said she wants to tell him a secret. Yujia walked up to him closely, Ren in turn covered in sweat from excitement. Z whispered in his ear that if he hadn't turned out to be her brother in time, she might have loved someone else. The next morning, Hao went to school, where he struggled to wait for his last class, at the end of which, Teacher Han asked him to follow her. The students literally freaked out, not understanding why she chose him again. They stared embitteredly at Jen, who in turn hurried after Miss Su. After a few moments, he suddenly found himself in an incomprehensible place. There were no lights and carelessly scattered things all over the room. Bags of trash stood near the table. The unknown apartment was a mess. Empty liquor bottles and sheets of paper were just lying on the floor. Seeing Teacher Han, Hao inquired where En was. She replied that he was at her house. Jen asked why there were no lights in her apartment. Su said that the power went out unexpectedly, which was why she called him, because he specialized in mechanical engineering. And now he has a chance to practice. Hao reached into the panel where the meter was located. Jen smilingly remarked that Miss Su didn't know much about the workings of electricity because it was just a matter of turning on the switch. Hao turned on the light. The teacher replied that she teaches math, not physics, threatening him with a D in the subject. Jen apologized to her, then sat down on the couch and thought about the fact that everything looked kind of suspicious. The protagonist started to get nervous. Meanwhile, Miss Han asked what he would drink, tea or coffee. The teacher was standing in her nightwear. Hao was extremely surprised. He asked her to make him coffee, not understanding when or why she had changed her clothes. Teacher Su made him some coffee, then kindly handed Zheng a cup, sitting down on the couch beside him. They sipped their drinks in silence for a while. Hao still seemed suspicious of it. A little embarrassed and blushing, Ren said that in private, Miss Han is like a different person. Su leaned back on the back of the sofa and replied that it was because she was with him now. Besides, they knew each other's secrets. At this time, Hao looked towards the table and noticed a cockroach that was crawling on the surface. Teacher Han also saw it, causing a shout to rise up. Jen in turn tried to calm down the screaming teacher Su. Then our hero decided to help her clean the apartment. He swept the room, after which he took the trash bags outside to the dumpster. Meanwhile, night had fallen. When Hao returned, he began to wipe the dust, and after a while the apartment was literally shining clean. Jen suggested that she should clean more often to keep the cockroaches away. Teacher Han thanked him for his help and for today in general. Hao said he had no idea how unfit she was to live on her own. And because she is a cultivator at this moment, Teacher Su generated a kind of fire sword, then promptly threw a punch at him. Hao dodged, asking what happened to her. Miss Han ignored his question and continued to attack him with her sword. Jen activated his abilities and easily fought her off. But that didn't stop her. He thought Teacher Su had lost her mind, because he could find no other logical explanation for her actions. At a certain moment, Miss Han's sword was right in front of Hao's eye. He immediately activated a protective barrier that she couldn't penetrate with her sword. Teacher Su stopped attacking Jen, saying that he was pretty good at defending himself. He could use his spiritual energy to form a barrier, and now the last step to the first realm was left. A surprised Hao wondered if she was just testing his cultivation basics. Teacher Han replied positively, after which she demanded him to fight her. Hao said in surprise that he was no match for her and probably couldn't handle her. Miss Su replied that she would only defend herself, and he had 3 minutes to touch her with his sword, in which case he would win. Ren said that Teacher Han was looking up to him. After all, touching his sword energy is easy. Teacher Su reminded him that she was the inspector, and if Hao can still defeat her in battle, a special reward awaits him. Jen asked her what special award she was talking about now. Miss Han ignored his question and pulled out her sword and called out to Hao to show what he could do. The protagonist concentrated, actively using his abilities, after which he released several lightning arrows at Teacher Su. She noticed that he had a large amount of spiritual energy, but the strength of his punch was just as important, adding that the normal attacks of the 5 elements can't harm her in any way. Jen pondered, after all, if that was really the case, perhaps it made sense to combine the 5 elements. He instantly assumed a characteristic pose and released an electric ball at her. Assuming that she would be able to be damaged by the lightning element, Han swept up. That this zipper element is actually a pretty good idea, but since it's made up of 5 elements, it still won't work against her. Teacher Su easily repelled his attack with her sword. Hao began to ponder how to harm her. Miss Han wondered if he wanted to give up, since there was only a minute left. Jen didn't understand how he could get his hands on her spiritual energy, because the attacks of the 5 elements and lightning couldn't break Su's defense. Suddenly, he tried attacking her with lightning balls again, hoping for a successful result. Teacher Han said that she had already realized his strength level, and it wouldn't be a big deal if he lost. The fog of dust created by his attacks made it impossible for her to detect Hao. Teacher Su scrutinized him carefully in the dissipating smoke. Suddenly, Ren appeared right in front of her and tried to strike her with his magic sword. However, Miss Han had time to react, thus blocking his attack. They clashed their blades together, creating a distinctive sound as they did so, after which Jen took a step backward for his next strike. Hao rather abruptly threw himself towards Teacher Su, trying to attack her, which he did manage to do, leaving a cut on her clothes as a result. The teacher clearly did not expect such a thing from our hero, which was pleasantly surprised. Han said that he had won after all. Mastering such martial skills while not reaching the first realm was not bad. Hao walked over to her and replied that he would buy her another beautiful dress. Miss Su turned away and left, saying that it was not necessary. At this moment, the lights suddenly turned off. The teacher froze in place, then looked out the window and said it was irreversibly closing in on him. An anxious and uncomprehending Jen asked what exactly was coming. After a few seconds, he felt a kind of discomfort inside him, after which Hao suddenly fell to the floor, wondering what was happening to him. Miss Han replied that he had used spiritual energy during the battle, thus activating the Dragon Core. As such, he is on the verge of finally making his way to First Reign. Su hooked up with him, saying that a Kong-level heavenly calamity was about to happen, and Zhen Yu would have to open the dragon's lair, adding that she would try to protect him. Hao wondered what den she was talking about, his face turning blue. Han replied that the dragon's lair is a point in the Dragon Core. Starting from the Kang stage, each stage will open a point. The more dots, the more spiritual energy the core assimilates, and Hao would be able to become a dragon after opening 7 dots. Outside the window at this time, thunder rumbled. Zhen asked how he could open a point in the Dragon Core. Su replied that to do so, one must channel the lightning inside one's body to refine it, adding that he must have read about it in the scroll, about the fusion of the 5 elements of the Light Path sword. Hao questioned her. Whether or not he was correct about the need to refine his body with lightning, the thunderclaps outside the window were still rumbling the same way. Teacher Han generated a magic sword and got to her feet. Su said that he needed to start cultivating right away, which Jen subsequently did, saying to yourself that the spine corresponds to 24 Shi, the lungs 12 Chanlu, and the gut 18 Yi. Chonggong's heart, Huagai's soul, Huaqi's tongue, and Yenshin's feet. At this moment, lightning entered him. Hao thought his body was about to explode. Electric shocks seemed to pass through all his organs. Jen didn't realize how much longer this was going to go on. Lightning bolts were coming out of him. Suddenly, everything stopped. Opening his eyes, he found himself flying in an unknown space. Seeing the Dragon Core, he assumed he was inside his body. At this time, an incomprehensible roar sounded. Hao became wary and listened. An electric dragon flashed by lightning. Everything around shimmered. Jen covered himself with his hands. After that, he thought he needed to take control of this dragon. Hao reached out with his hand towards the muzzle of the lightning-sparkling dragon. Then, still grasping it, there was a distinctive crackle of electricity. Jen literally rode him, the dragon in turn emitting a deafening roar. Hao aimed it straight at the Dragon Core. The lightning monster tried to resist. The protagonist insisted. He shouted for him to fly into the blazing energy core. After several manipulations by the dragon, they finally flew into the core. There was a rumbling sound. Once inside, the dragon shimmered even more, after which the lightning bolts once again started striking Jen's body. He cried out in wild pain. His eyes sparkled with magic, electric currents emanating from them. After a few seconds, Hao seemed to come to his senses. He was sitting on the floor. Teacher Han immediately rushed over to him, wondering if he had succeeded. At this moment, lightning appeared behind her. Jen instantly reacted, pushing Teacher Su aside and using her abilities. An electric dragon flew out from Hao's body and headed straight for the lightning bolt. In the aftermath, there was a large and loud explosion in the sky. With the glass shattering the windows, Ren covered Miss Han. To save her from injury, it was over in a few moments. They looked out the window at the sky, where there were no more rolling thunderclaps. Teacher Su sincerely thanked our hero for saving her. Hao asked how she was feeling. Han said she was fine. She was an inspector after all. Miss Su congratulated him on his breakthrough to Kang, adding that a special reward awaited him. Jen denied in every way possible. Saying that he was only her apprentice, Han hurriedly appointed him as her assistant. Hao didn't know how to react. Su said that she had never come across a suitable candidate before, and she was choosing him. Technically a freelance handyman, and he doesn't need to worship at the Dragon Temple, Jen asked why him. The instructor remarks that she can't see the joy in his eyes, and if he doesn't want to, he can refuse. Hao replied that he was willing to be her assistant. Su demanded that she sign a contract in that case. Ren naturally agreed to sign the contract with Miss Han the next day at school. Sisters Linlin and Lily asked Hao why he became an assistant inspector, noticing the inspector's mark on his head, which is what the twins told him. Jen thought the contract imprinted on his body. He found it amusing. Linlin said that once he became an assistant, he was required to take the exam every year, and if he failed it, he would die. Hao was shocked by such news that he had somehow not been notified by Teacher Han. Jen asked if he could decline the position. Lily replied in the negative. Now he must take the exam until he is a full-fledged inspector, and only then can he leave. Otherwise, Hao would be immediately dealt with if he wished to leave without a reason. Jen understood that free cheese is only in a mousetrap, and Miss Su had specifically chosen it. He had many questions about what the exam was, when the first one would begin, and what his chances of success were. Twin replied that the inspectors choose the essence of the exam and its timing. Lily had noticed that inspectors like to take people by surprise, and the exam could be about anything. And since Hao had only managed to reach Kang's level, his chances of success were extremely slim. Jen was literally shocked, realizing that he had fallen into a death trap. Meanwhile, someone they never expected to see arrived at the university. A beautiful sports car, bright red in color, drove onto the school grounds. Parked outside one of the buildings, all the students began to wonder who it was. A young guy came out of the car, in whom they recognized the famous artist Qin Shaoyang. With red long hair and wearing glasses, he headed to the university. The girls in turn expressed their respect for him, still not understanding why he had come to their school. Hao was watching. He didn't understand why everyone had such a reaction and why he was so popular. Teacher Han said it was Qin Shaoyang, the best artist in Asia with many fans. Adding that this was his identity in the human world, Miss Su sat down in the chair. He is a dragon family inspector in charge of the Heavenly Mountain, being a genius in cultivation as well as an examiner. At the exam Hao would soon be taking, Ren assumed he had come to test him. Teacher Han replied that Shaoyang is basically trying to woo her. Su urged Jen to be careful, for Qin had done away with all the men who surrounded her, and his exam would not be easy. Hao remarked, "This sounded rather frightening," assuming that Shaoyang must have a strong affection for Miss Han. Teacher Su said that Qin had given her 2 tickets to his exhibition that would be held in a couple of days. Smiling, she offered Jen to keep her company, calling him the protector of the girls. Hao clearly didn't like Teacher Han's scheme, but he decided to remain silent. A banner was put up on the school building welcoming Qin Shaoyan. The students assumed he would hold an exhibition at their place. Walking through the university and seeing Qin's paintings, Hao found them amazing. Su said that he is one of the best in the world. He is also best known for his oil paintings, and recently one of his works was sold at auction for $1 million. Jen was literally shocked to hear such a figure, and he asked the teacher again. Shaoyan has extensive experience in ink and gouache paintings, and this exhibition will showcase his ink works, Su added. That's why it attracted the attention of the art circles, at which point Qin showed up in the company of 2 girls. He said he would give Han the painting she liked. Miss Su replied that she had come to the exhibition at the school's request. Shaoyan asked her not to be so cold to him. After all, he had organized this exhibition for her to see and appreciate his hard work. He took her hand and didn't want to let go of it, which didn't please Teacher Han. At this time, Hao intervened, saying that Miss Su didn't like this kind of treatment. Shaoyan instantly shifted his gaze to Jen, after which he uttered that he had heard about him from Han. He actually didn't like Hao's behavior, but he restrained himself, then still let go of Teacher Su's hand, turning everything into a joke. Allegedly, he was too happy to see her, so he didn't hold back and asked Han not to hold a grudge, adding that he had business to attend to, and they could look around. Miss Su said that Hao got into trouble because of this incident. Jen replied that her face was displeased, due to which he couldn't stand it. Han said that Qin was too narcissistic, and he wouldn't get away from him now. Suddenly, Teacher Su stopped. Ren also slowed down. She said she was happy about this turn of events because he had pleasantly surprised her again. The host of the exhibition said how lucky they all were to see Mr. Chin's ink paintings, adding that Mr. Xiaoyan mainly works on oil paintings, and also this exhibit will be an omen. The official development of Chinese national painting with the help of Mr. Chin. At this moment Hao saw Z. He caught up with Yanzi and tried to stop her and put his hand on her shoulder. She inquired what he was doing here. Ren replied that he was invited by Miss Su, then asked her a similar question. Su said her father couldn't make it, so she had to come in his place. The presenter went on to say that Mr. Chin would create a masterpiece in front of everyone's eyes to show his enthusiasm in ink paintings. Xiaoyan rolled up his sleeves, after which he took a brush in his hand and began to paint. Everyone watched his smooth hand movements admiringly, looking closely at what exactly he was drawing, even though it was initially hard to understand. After a while, Xiaoyan finished working on his painting. Putting down his brush, he stepped back so everyone could enjoy his work, which was a beautiful landscape. People started shouting that they would pay him 800,000. Others offered 1.5 million for the painting. Someone asked to sell it for 3 million, but Chin rolled up the canvas. After which, ignoring all suggestions, he headed towards Teacher Han. Walking up to Su, Xiaoyan gave the painting to her, saying that he did it for her. The teacher in turn accepted the gift from him, then looked him in the eye. Suddenly ripped the painting into small pieces, which infuriated the people around her. Some wondered why she had torn up his work. Others rebuked the fact that it had cost a fortune. Miss Han replied that it was only a painting, and she would give him another as compensation. She turned to Hao and kindly asked him to draw something for her. He was shocked. Jen replied that he couldn't even draw a chicken pecking rice, hinting at his inability to do so. People started saying that they didn't believe in this guy and his abilities. Especially he couldn't compare to the great Xiaoyang. Because a layman can't do that, Chin urged everyone to calm down, saying that it's just a painting. However, there is one small point. Xiaoyan angrily looked at Jen, after which he took out a blank canvas and laid it on his desk. Chin said he wanted to see his drawing skills, maybe he was good at it. Jen was perplexed. He tried in every way possible to reject the idea. Realizing that he had no chance, Hao said he would draw a chicken pecking rice in that case. The teacher encouraged him to relax and do whatever she told him to do, adding that she believes in him and things will definitely work out for Jen. They walked over to the table with the canvas paper. Hao was confused and didn't know what to do. The teacher said to use whichever element she would name, and from 1 to 10, take the right amount of powder. In accordance with the number she named, Zhen queried if she was hinting at drawing with the shadow scroll of the dividing sword light. Teacher Han asked him to calm down and concentrate, then remember the picture he saw. On top of that, he needed to replicate exactly all of Xiaoyan's movements, gestures, and strokes. Ren said he remembered everything. Su urged him to just listen to her carefully. He took the brush in his hand. Miss Han named the metal element. Hao began to run his brush across the canvas. After which, remembering Chin's movements, swung the brush to the side. Then once more, Zhen tried to repeat all the strokes as clearly as possible. A certain image of the land was already being created on paper, and the teacher could see that everything was going quite well. A girl standing in the crowd remarked that there was a lot of power in his strokes. Miss Su uttered water. 5. Hao concentratedly performed all the actions. Drops of ink fell gently onto the canvas. Everyone present froze in anticipation. The teacher then named the element of the tree. 4. Zhen leisurely drew further, realizing that he needed to constantly transform one type of his 5-element spiritual energy into another, channeling into the brush. Hao had no idea that it was so difficult. He diligently swiped the brush. At a certain point, Ren declared that he couldn't hold on any longer. Miss Han replied that she would help him in that case. Su walked up behind him. Literally guiding his hand with the brush onto the paper, Han pronounced the next element, water, 7. Zhen Yu felt embarrassed. He realized how it might have looked from the outside. But they continued to paint together. The people around them were involved in the process. They didn't utter a word so as not to disturb their drawing by watching what was going on. In a few minutes, the painting was complete. It was truly beautiful. Suddenly, Hao dropped the brush from his hand. He was literally exhausted and was falling down without strength. Teacher Han managed to pick him up, thanking him for his hard work. Afterwards, asking Chin if he liked Zhen's painting, she asked him to comment. Looking at the canvas, Xiaoyan realized that he had used a scroll of shadows of the separating sword light, for there was a gulf between the two in drawing, and Teacher Su clearly shared her spiritual energy with him. One old man commented that it was a stunning picture that you couldn't look at without rapture. People among themselves came to a consensus, saying that this work was as good as the one drawn by Mr. Chin. Xiaoyan was furious, but didn't show any signs, agreeing with the old man, adding that this picture was even better than his. Everyone was shocked by this result. They became interested in Hao's identity. At this moment, Miss Han came over to Qing Yu. She handed Zhen's painting to him. Xiaoyan, in turn, nervously snatched it from Su's hands and headed towards the exit. There was no limit to his anger. He thought that he would take revenge on Han and Hao sooner or later.